Hey everybody, it's Rabid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be comparing the free-to-play tank-based games with 15 vs 15 matches, research trees, upgrades, crew skills, premium vehicles, silver currency, and gold currency, World of Tanks, and War Thunder. Now, anyone who's only been with the channel for about the past year or so would know me mostly for my War Thunder content. However, the very early days of the channel, I did actually make some World of Tanks content. The problem is that was several years ago, so in order to get a fresh perspective on the game, I decided to log back in and see what I could do. Now, when I logged back in, there was a special package for the Batchat 25T that included a Sisters of Battle skin, and that seemed like a win-win, so I could grind my way up to this tier 10 vehicle, and in the process I could get an idea of the current state of the game, the upgrade systems, how they've changed, and how they affect the current gameplay. While I was at it, I also decided to pick up a few other vehicles, both to get an idea for other types of gameplay, and also just to provide some more variety with the gameplay in the background. Additionally, I decided that going through the War Thunder French tech tree would also get me to a similar vehicle, the Char 25T, and provide a useful point of comparison versus how the Batchat and the Char actually work in both games. Now, before we can do any real comparison, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly are we comparing? There are currently 3 versions of World of Tanks, a PC version, a console version, and a mobile version. And there are also 2 versions of War Thunder, a PC and console version, and a mobile version. Comparing the mobile versions would be a little awkward, so we're going to stick to the PC and console versions. The most common version and game mode for each game: for World of Tanks it is the PC version and the random queue, and for War Thunder is the PC/console version and the ground realistic battle mode. So that is what we will be comparing for the duration of this video. However, it is important to note that both games have quite a few different game modes, so if there are aspects of them that you like but other aspects that you don't, it might be worth checking out some of those alternative game modes just to see if those fit your fancy. And this also brings us to the first major point of comparison, in that in World of Tanks it is fully crossplay, so depending on which systems you and your friends have, it might be a better pick. Although if you are just playing it on your own and looking for a way to pass time, both of the games basically serve the same purpose. This brings us neatly to our next point of comparison, and that is the types of vehicles available in both games. World of Tanks is fairly simple in that it is exclusively ground vehicles, and by and large it is tracked ground vehicles with very few wheeled vehicles in the game right now. Currently there is a British wheeled medium tree and a French wheeled light tree, and other than that every vehicle in the game is fully tracked. It's also important to note eras in that World of Tanks goes from the 1920s to about the 1960s plus or minus. This much narrower focus on terms of types and era of vehicles means that in order to fully flesh out tech trees, there are a lot more experimental vehicles in the game, and you should definitely expect that. In terms of War Thunder has a much wider array of vehicles, including naval and air vehicles, and it also covers a much wider spectrum from about the 1930s to literally the 2020s. Some vehicles in that game are entering production basically as we speak right now. In this respect, War Thunder does have a much broader array of vehicles and doesn't have to lean as much on experimental vehicles, so you will see a lot more authentic vehicles both in the matchmaker and in the tech trees in general. It's also important to note, and you'll see this as we go into gameplay, that World of Tanks has a very fine focus on exactly how vehicles are supposed to interact with each other, whereas War Thunder kind of doesn't. And that means even vehicles that might otherwise fit World of Tanks, you won't really find in the game because they simply don't fit within that formula, whereas War Thunder can kind of include pretty much anything and make it work, at least to some extent. Obviously, if there is a specific vehicle that would be a deal breaker for you personally, whether you or a family member served alongside that vehicle or you just really like it, you should definitely check to see if it's in the game before you start it up. And this neatly brings us around to our last point before we start up with the actual gameplay comparisons. Both of these are free-to-play live service games. As far as the player population, both of them seem to be pretty healthy. I was able to get matches within about 30 seconds pretty consistently across both games. So in general, I didn't notice any issues with the player population and problems with matchmaking. Additionally, these are live service free-to-play games, so mechanics, vehicles are constantly being changed, added, new game modes are being tweaked, that kind of stuff. So some of this information may be out of date if you're watching this very far in the future. Now in terms of gameplay comparison, I like to work my way down from the smallest elements to the largest elements, because it turns out the moment-to-moment gameplay is what's going to affect your positive or negative feelings of the experience, especially if it's a game like this that's a live service game that you'll probably play on and off for a few years. So we're going to start out with the most basic element, and that is the movement. Both World of Tanks and War Thunder use the appropriately named tank-style movement controls. That is to say, forward and backwards moves you forward and backwards, whereas left or right to turn you instead of strafing you like it would with most first-person shooters. And this is also where we get to one of the more interesting differences between the two games when you start getting into things like wheeled vehicles. The British wheeled medium tanks behave exactly like a normal tank in that they even spin in place. However, the French wheeled light tanks, if you don't press forward or backwards and just press to the left or right, it will actually turn it in a very tight circle. In War Thunder, this is very different. All turning left or right does without pushing forward or backwards is it turns the wheels to the left or right, so that when you do push forward or backwards, you will get a tighter turning arc. So that is a minor difference between the two games. Another much larger difference between the two games is how it handles turning while moving. So in World of Tanks, it feels like the tanks were on rails, and I couldn't really put my finger on exactly why, and then I realized they kind of are on rails. So what happens is when you turn while moving, the vehicle automatically takes a turning circle that is appropriate to maintain your speed while moving. So you are kind of on rails. It won't let you just fly out of control or lose all of your speed by turning the wheel too tight. This means in practice that in World of Tanks, if I were to put you in a giant parking lot, you could simply maintain your speed indefinitely because there's no obstacles or anything slowing down, or that you have to slow down to turn inside of, which is kind of an interesting difference, especially compared to War Thunder, where War Thunder will let you just skid into a building or off a cliff if you turn the wheel too tight while moving at high speeds. In fact, moving at high speeds in War Thunder can be somewhat difficult to maintain control of the vehicle, especially some of the heavier vehicles that have a lot of mass, as that mass and weight will make it more difficult to maintain control of the vehicle, or at the bare minimum will make it difficult to maintain your speed while turning. Of note, in terms of mobility characteristics of individual vehicles, both games handle it a little differently. World of Tanks plays a lot more fast and loose, looking for good gameplay experiences, and they've already admitted several times that characteristics such as reverse speeds are often completely fake just to make for a better gameplay experience. War Thunder, on the other hand, goes with authenticity, even if that authenticity is very annoying or very tedious to play. This means that War Thunder does focus on things like gearing ratios for vehicles a lot more than World of Tanks that has very similar gearing ratios. It's not really an issue, but it also means that War Thunder has amazing reverse gears that go as low as 4 or 3 kilometers an hour in some cases. That is just painfully annoying to play. In the clip in the background, I am reversing at the maximum speed this vehicle is allotted, and as you can see, it is not terrifically fast. Both games also handle effects of things like terrain quite differently as well. In World of Tanks, terrain is handled on an individual vehicle basis, with each vehicle having their own set of terrain modifiers for different types of terrain. In War Thunder, terrain modifiers are universal to a type of vehicle, so all wheeled vehicles will perform incredibly well on surfaces like concrete, but incredibly poorly on surfaces like mud. As a bit of a side note, World of Tanks doesn't really like putting incredibly soft terrain modifiers on, say, an entire map. It'll usually only be on select parts. Conversely, War Thunder is actually okay with this, and this led to a rather hilarious moment when they introduced a bunch of new snow maps and realized that most vehicles couldn't actually perform very well on snow, so they had to rework all of the terrain modifiers for snow for basically every class of vehicle, just so these brand new maps weren't complete crap to play on. As far as special terrain effects like ice in World of Tanks, it doesn't really do anything. It's more like just a giant parking lot. There are limited time modes wherein ice will actually cause vehicles to slip and slide, but generally speaking, it's basically just normal hard ground. War Thunder treats ice as, well, ice. It's difficult to accelerate, it's difficult to stop, and it's difficult to change direction. However, these are not generally in parts of the map that you actually need to go on, so it is kind of an optional mechanic. As far as water features, deep enough water features in World of Tanks are effectively impassable. If you go deep enough in the vehicle, you get a counter. When that counter reaches 0, your vehicle will just straight up be destroyed. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. In War Thunder, it handles the drowning mechanic a little differently. You still get a timer when your crew is submerged in water. However, it is very notable in War Thunder that when the timer is up, only the crew members that are actually fully under the water will actually take damage. This can get you in scenarios where only the crew in the hull is actually taking damage and dying, whereas the crew in the turret are fine. However, in War Thunder, you have to have a driver and you have to have a gunner, so if your driver is killed, somebody will move from the turret to take his place, and usually the driver is in the hull. This can lead to scenarios in very rare instances where you can actually get enough mobility between crew members dying and replacing each other to back yourself out of the water feature. However, this is kind of rare, and it can also lead to scenarios where teammates can potentially help and pull you out of the water, which again is kind of rare. Most of the time, this does basically function the same as the World of Tanks mechanic, in which once the counter reaches 0, you're probably just going to die. Additionally, War Thunder does feature a number of vehicles that can just float in the water, so they can just drive in and be perfectly fine. However, it is notable that there is a difference in the amount of turbulence you'll encounter in the water between, say, a nice serene lake and the open ocean. And for maps that have open oceans, a lot of the amphibious vehicles will actually struggle to keep above water enough to not drown, which is kind of interesting. And that seems like a nice segue into how both games handle collision with terrain features. In World of Tanks, if you collide with a terrain feature going fast enough, or if you fall off a cliff going fast enough, you will take damage. Now, the amount of damage you take depends on whether or not you're able to land on your tracks. For example, if you were to take a relatively large fall, but you were to land on your suspension and your suspension absorbs all of it, you won't take that much damage. Conversely, if you were to flip and land on your turret, well, you're probably going back to the hangar. Additionally, in World of Tanks, if your vehicle is flipped and you don't have any way to unflip yourself, the game will give you a 15-second timer, and if you've reached the end of that timer and you still haven't been able to move, the game will automatically deploy you right side up. War Thunder doesn't generally have collision with obstacles as a major factor, and also doesn't have any falling damage. However, you can run into weird scenarios where if you hit an obstacle going fast enough, you can break one of your tracks, or in this particular instance in the background, I lose both my transmission and my driver because I hit a rock going particularly fast, which is something I have never seen happen before or since. Which also brings up the point of War Thunder is kind of inconsistent. In fact, that's the most consistent part of the game, is that it is inconsistent, and we're going to see that multiple times throughout the course of this comparison. As a bit of a side note, both War Thunder and World of Tanks add artificial weighting to the bottom of a vehicle, so it is actually kind of difficult to flip it unless you're rolling down a hill, and you will generally right yourself unless you're taking a pretty extreme or pretty quick maneuver. And this seems like a good time to bring up the tow cable mechanic in War Thunder, and it doesn't really have an equivalent mechanic in World of Tanks. What this is you can attach a tow cable to either any wrecked vehicle or any friendly that has specifically requested assistance, and then you can attempt to drag either the wrecked vehicle or the friendly vehicle. You can use this to kind of drag friendly vehicles out of positions where they're stuck in. You can use this to try and help vehicles that are capsized. You can also use this to drag friendly vehicles that have been immobilized in the line of fire, or in this scenario, you can use it to help a teammate up and then throw a tow cable to them so they can help you up. Overall, it is just a interesting and versatile mechanic, and this seemed like a good time to bring it up. Now, all of that is all well and good, but to give you some real examples of how this translates in the gameplay, here we have an example from the Watt Replays website. This is the player 2 unique in the mouse. Now you can see the mouse actually moves and accelerates reasonably well, despite the fact that it's 180 tons. In fact, it's accelerating so fast you can see it rock on its suspension when it's moving forward and backwards. This is kind of indicative of World of Tanks and the way it handles mobility in general, because broadly speaking, vehicle mass isn't a huge factor, and it's mostly just the hard stats of top speed, power to weight ratio, etc. that actually dictates how a vehicle moves. Now we're going to move into the War Thunder video of a mouse, and you can see this is a lot more sluggish. Getting up to its top speed takes forever. Turning basically kills all of its speed. It doesn't even move anywhere near fast enough to rock backwards on its suspension, and it's more like a moving house, whereas the World of Tanks version was more like just a big heavy truck. Moving from one of the slowest vehicles to one of the fastest, this is General Hans 98 in the EBR, also from the Watt Replays website. You can see the vehicle turns, accelerates incredibly well, and basically only ever loses speed if the player wants it to lose speed or if it's hitting some kind of obstacle. In this respect, the EBR handles very easily. Now, if we look at the same vehicle in the game of War Thunder, you notice a massive difference in terms of the vehicle's automotive performance. It doesn't turn or accelerate well at all, especially if it's trying to do any kind of maneuvering. Additionally, here's an interesting trivia question. Which vehicle is faster, the EBR in World of Tanks or the EBR that you see on screen right now in War Thunder? The answer is actually the EBR in War Thunder. It has a maximum speed of 110 kilometers an hour. However, as you can see in this clip, we're barely breaking 60 because we're moving across sand, which is obviously something that a wheeled vehicle like the EBR doesn't like. And then again, who does like sand? But this does also illustrate the point that even though a vehicle in War Thunder may have a high top speed, things like its ability to cross terrain and its acceleration can often be a much more important factor, whereas in World of Tanks the game is much happier to give you big open fields that you can drive vehicles at their top speed, basically without restrictions. Now, being able to move around the battlefield is all well and good, but at the end of the day you do actually have to interact with the other players. So the main way you interact with the other players is obviously by shooting them. And the first thing we're going to cover in this section isn't so much the process of shooting, but a feature that War Thunder has and World of Tanks doesn't, and that is actually pretty helpful in the attack process, as you will see when we start going into how you actually penetrate or damage hostile vehicles. In the game of War Thunder, you can go up to any vehicle in any tech tree, you can hit the drop down menu and select the preview option. What this does is it brings up a separate interface where now you can do an x-ray view to see what all the internals look like, you can see what all the modifications look like, what all the stats look like, and more importantly, there is an armor protection analysis. In this protection analysis, you don't just get to see the armor and its effective thickness against different shells, but you can also select any vehicle in the game and then any shell available to that vehicle and just fire it at the vehicle in the protection analysis to see how different shells react and what type of damage you can expect to do. This is an invaluable tool for newer players, and I don't know why the developers don't hype this up more, because it is very useful if you're having trouble with specific vehicles. For example, if you were struggling to figure out how to penetrate a Panther using an 76 Sherman, you just bring up the protection analysis for the Panther in question, go to the little drop down, select the 76 Sherman, select whatever shell you are interested in firing at it, and then just click away. It also has a heat map you can activate to show you potential protections. In World of Tanks, the game doesn't have this natively. You have to go to external clients such as tanks.gg. Additionally, you can go to any vehicle that you either currently have or that you are in a position to research, or alternatively any premium vehicle, and you can simply select the test drive option. The test drive option will put you on a range that has not only different terrain types but also different targets, and you can even select different conditions for the test drive, such as different times of day, etc. And it's very weird to me that World of Tanks, despite being 10 years old and despite these kind of test drives or firing ranges being very common with a lot of modern games, haven't even talked about adding something like this to the game yet. And it is pretty nice to have in War Thunder if you just want to check out how a vehicle performs other than just something like basic stats. Now, in order to shoot an enemy, the first thing you're going to have to do is select a shell type. World of Tanks has a total of 3 different shell types per tank. Some do only have 2, but this is pretty uncommon and the vast majority will have 3. The first shell is going to be your basic shell type. These do standard penetration and standard damage, and these are generally your bread and butter shells. The next shell type is the high explosive shells. High explosive shells generally have very low penetration, but also have very high damage, so they're pretty useful if you see something that's lightly armored and that you want to do more damage to in a shorter period of time, or you just want to save yourself some shots. Additionally, they can sometimes do chip damage if they don't fully penetrate the enemy's armor. However, this is based on how thick the armor they're hitting is, so against particularly heavily armored opponents, this will often do very little or nothing. This is also a pretty noteworthy change, because if you had played World of Tanks back in the day, high explosive shells used to function quite differently. They would actually check within an area to find the weakest part of armor to penetrate, so even against heavily armored opponents, they could often find much weaker pieces of armor and would do more damage. Additionally, they used to search in an AoE, whereas now they only search the target point, so what this means is you can't really splash other targets with high explosive like you used to back in the day. I still fondly remember my very first double kill, and my only double kill was something that wasn't an artillery in the FE 4005, where I took out an opponent with a HESH round and also knocked out an enemy nearby that was around a corner. It was a pretty funny moment, but not currently something you can do in World of Tanks as it is. The third shell type is premium or gold ammo if you're a watt boomer like me, and this has the same damage as your standard shell but has better penetration. You might rightfully be thinking, if it has the same damage but better penetration, why wouldn't you always use it? The main answer is really economic. They usually cost significantly more silver, to the point where if you're just maining gold ammo, it's very easy to go negative in a match, especially if you don't have a premium account. There are other shell attributes. APCR tends to have worse normalization, heat rounds can detonate on obstacles, as can high explosive rounds. However, most of the time this doesn't really come up, as the World of Tanks maps aren't really built in such a way that these features are a big factor in terms of what type of shell you choose. So 9 times out of 10, the premium ammo or the gold ammo is just the best choice if you can afford to shoot it. Now, you can switch between shell types by hitting the number key. However, by default, hitting it once will only make sure the next shell you fire is of that type. If you hit it twice in rapid succession, it will actually start a new reload of that new shell type without costing you the old shell. There can also be some other attributes associated with different shell types based on the vehicle. For example, high explosive shells might have a lower velocity, so if you want to lead a target, it will be more difficult, but that does vary from vehicle to vehicle. Unlike World of Tanks, War Thunder tends to be a lot less regimented and consistent about exactly what shell types you will have access to, or even how many. For example, the Chinese PTZ-89 has a whopping 2 shells, an APFSDS round, and a high explosive round, and if you want to be using a different round, you should probably select a different tank. The American M47, on the other hand, has a whopping 7 different shells, of which 2 are only slightly different APCR shells. And you might ask, what is the point of 2 shells that have basically the same characteristics and slightly different stats? Well, it isn't economic like it would be in a game like World of Tanks. It's actually just related to the researching tech tree. You have to research one of the APCR shells to get to the other APCR shell. That's because in War Thunder you research shells, and whereas in World of Tanks you actually research guns, and the shells for that gun are automatically unlocked. What this means is that not every shell in War Thunder has a direct in-game use, and some of them are just wholly redundant, especially after you have the vehicle fully upgraded. War Thunder also has a fairly bewildering array of different shell types, everything from simple solid pieces of metal all the way up to guided missiles with tandem warheads, and the game does an almost supernaturally bad job of explaining to the players exactly how all these shells work and what their use cases are. For this part of the video, just know that if it's a kinetic round with no explosive filler, you can shoot through obstacles like houses, trees, fences, sometimes. The game is actually really inconsistent about it, like it is with many other things. However, if you have things like heat FS rounds, high explosive rounds, HESH rounds, they will detonate if they hit obstacles. Again, sometimes the game is very inconsistent with its hitboxes. Infamously, the map Japan and its bamboo trees are actually pretty terrible for this. The big exception to all of this is the armor-piercing high explosive shells that will only explode if they go through a certain amount of armor, so these shells actually can be fired through some particularly thin obstacles like fences and trees, but will still detonate once they get inside of an enemy vehicle, and we'll go more about all of that when we talk about how you actually damage the enemy vehicles. If you want to reload a shell, you just hit the button associated with that shell type and fire the current shell out of the chamber. In War Thunder, you can't do a forced reload like you can in World of Tanks, where it simply replaces the shell on the spot. You simply have to select the round and then fire your current round out of the chamber, and your next round will be the selected one. This is also a good time to mention the smoke round, which is a utility round that some tanks have access to that you can fire and will generate a smoke screen, either to cover a lane so you can cross it or to blind enemies. World of Tanks currently does not have a feature that is analogous to this. Now that we have our shell loaded, let's try to actually shoot it at the enemy. Now, in World of Tanks, it's very notable that the game automatically does elevation for you. So while you might have to lead a target, you don't have to aim upwards at all to hit a target that is particularly far away. Additionally, World of Tanks doesn't use negative lead, and we'll go more into what negative lead is when we go into War Thunder, because that game actually does use negative lead. But for the purposes of this section, all you really have to know is that in order to aim at an enemy that is perfectly stationary, all you have to do is put the crosshair on that enemy and pull the trigger. Now, because the game does automatically calculate elevation for you, even with particularly low velocity guns, it's actually kind of difficult to hit somebody you can't see. It is technically possible, but it basically requires fooling the game into thinking that you're shooting at something other than what you're really shooting, which requires very specific setups of enemies and terrain to work, and most players will go through years of playing and never see this setup. Now, the artillery class in World of Tanks obviously does have a way to indirectly fire at targets. However, because it functions so differently from every other vehicle, we're going to cover them separately later in this comparison. There is one interesting point to bring up in terms of World of Tanks, and that is all of the guns are effectively fully stabilized. That is to say, as long as the gun has the elevation and traverse angles and speed to keep up with your target, they will stay on your target. However, just because your gun will stay on target doesn't mean your shells will always land there, and that brings us to our next topic. World of Tanks has two values that govern whether or not you will hit your target. The first one is accuracy, and the second one is dispersion. Accuracy is your likelihood to hit a specific part in the middle of the aiming circle, and dispersion is actually how big your aiming circle gets, i.e. the area your shell can potentially hit. Good accuracy with poor dispersion means you will hit the center more often, but the area that your shell can deviate is very large. On the other hand, poor accuracy with really good dispersion means the area your shell can land is relatively small, but your likelihood of hitting dead center is actually pretty low. So in general, a tank with good accuracy but bad dispersion is an ideal sniper because at long range, any deviation is probably going to miss anyway, and a tank with good dispersion but poor accuracy is a great close range brawler because the enemies are up so close you don't actually need to hit dead center. Of course, your accuracy isn't static, and this is how the game represents guns being particularly unstable. You'll notice the circle on the outside gets bigger the more you move and turn your turret, and even after you fire a shot. However, if you sit there and aim in very carefully, the shell will get smaller and smaller until eventually it is the smallest size it can get. Once the circle is as small as it can get, you are now fully aimed, and there is nothing you can do to increase your accuracy further. This can lead to situations where you are debating whether or not you need to fully aim your shot as somebody else is bringing their gun to bear on you, or if you just want to take the dice roll and fire while it is not fully aimed, which of course is an interesting risk-reward mechanic. Combined, however, these systems do mean that you can perfectly aim your shot and completely miss, or you can just fire in the enemy's general direction and not aim particularly well and still directly hit. These are pretty rare, however, and the system on the whole does favor good decision making and good aim. One notable feature in World of Tanks is the auto aim feature. What auto aim does, if you put your crosshair on an enemy and press the button, it will lock on your gun to that target. So as long as the gun is physically capable of moving in such a way that it can stay on them, it will stay on them. The drawback of this system is that it only locks onto center mass, so if you need to hit weak points, it's not very good. Also, it doesn't apply any lead, so especially at longer ranges, it's not very useful. It's mostly useful for lighter and more mobile tanks if they're circling around an opponent and want to focus on movement, to just lock onto a target, because often if you're hitting sides or backs, you don't really need to hit specific weak points. One of the first things you'll notice in War Thunder about trying to hit targets is that your gun is not fully stabilized, at least not early on in the game. There are some short stabilizers that will stabilize the gun out at low speeds, and of course once you get to modern tanks they are fully stabilized, but a lot of early tanks have fairly unstable guns. This can to an extent be mitigated, especially on tanks with good suspension and on flat level ground like paved roads, but obviously this does take some practice. War Thunder does require you to lead your shots, but it also requires you to apply elevation to those shots. So if you have a target that is particularly far away, you will have to either aim up or use the sight distance controls to manually set the distance in your sights. However, War Thunder does have nice graduated sights that will give you the range for you. Notably, War Thunder does have a rangefinder feature to try and get range to a target, and it also has a binocular feature that is a view that is basically above the commander's view that you can use the rangefinder in. You can use this with particularly low velocity guns and the feature to manually apply elevation to actually hit targets you can't see, basically acting as an artillery piece. Of note, in both War Thunder and World of Tanks, third-person shots don't have reduced accuracy. They are exactly as accurate as normal shots. However, because you're in the third-person view, it is generally more difficult to land them. One difference that might not be immediately obvious between the two games is actually that War Thunder uses negative lead. Now, negative lead is when your tank is moving and you have to compensate for your own vehicle's movement. So if I am moving from left to right, I will actually have to aim to the left of my target so that my movement carries a shell into the shot. It doesn't come up that much because, much like in real life, in War Thunder you will still get your best accuracy while being stationary or close to stationary, but it is important to factor in if you are taking shots while moving relatively quickly. This actually brings up an interesting quirk of War Thunder in that the temperature of the map you're on will actually affect your shell's performance. On colder maps, your shells will actually move slower, and on hotter maps, your shells will move faster. This isn't pronounced enough that most players will really notice, but it is coded in. The game does not currently use windage, so you don't have to calculate that. However, it wouldn't shock me if it was added in some update in the future, as they do really like adding features like that, and they have already added wind effects. As one final note, a small misconception on shooting in War Thunder is that there is no randomness. There actually is randomness, it's just very minor, and you only really notice it if you're shooting at long range with shells that have particularly poor accuracy. These will often be things like early sabos that are very unstable, or low velocity shells. This means that landing a shot in War Thunder is often much more about individual accuracy and your ability to lead targets than it is about any random factors. Unlike in World of Tanks, where every vehicle has the same optical zoom, in War Thunder the zooms range from profoundly useless to basically the James Webb Space Telescope and everywhere in between. It just kind of varies on a vehicle-to-vehicle basis and is based on authenticity, not gameplay. So we've selected the shell and hit the target. How do we get into the enemy's armor? In World of Tanks, you have a green, yellow, or red indicator to indicate your likelihood of penetration. However, one interesting eccentricity is that the variance on the shell penetration is a plus or minus of 25%, which is actually enough to where on a green indicator, in extreme cases, you can fail to pen, or on a red indicator, also in extreme cases, you can successfully pen, because the penetration variance is enough that even when it says red, it still might be possible. Additionally, World of Tanks has a mechanic called overmatch. What overmatch is if your shell's bore diameter is greater than 3 times the thickness of an armor plate, your shell will always pass through that armor plate 100% of the time. It doesn't matter how heavily angled it is, and it doesn't matter what its effective thickness or your penetration is. This overmatch mechanic is not really explained anywhere, but is very important to know, especially if you're using tanks with higher caliber guns systems, like some of the tank destroyers or some of the heavy tanks. War Thunder uses flat penetration values, so there is no real random element, or at least there shouldn't be. A while back, War Thunder implemented a system called volumetric shells and armor. Now, in the original version of the game, the armor plates were paper thin and had a stat saying they had X millimeters of protection, and a shell was also an infinitely thin, basically laser pointer line that had a stat saying it was X type of shell. The problem with this system was that a very large shell like the 152mm shell on a KV could go straight through a driver's vision port. This wasn't a huge problem, but it did create some weird situations. Volumetric theoretically fixes this by making all of the armor plates the actual correct thickness and the shells the correct thickness as well. However, it also introduced some significant inconsistencies wherein shells could catch on weird parts of a tank or multiple plates, and the system would kind of spaz out and not treat them correctly. In fairness, it's pretty rare that volumetric just completely messes up a shell's penetration, but it does happen. The two biggest volumetric offenders are the T-34's driver's hatch that for some reason blocks long 88 rounds pretty consistently, and the Panther's mantlet that is a complete lottery as to whether or not you'll penetrate it. So while in theory penetration shouldn't involve any random elements, sometimes it does feel kind of arbitrary. So now we've gotten a shell into the enemy's crew compartment, how do we actually destroy them? In World of Tanks, it's fairly straightforward. Your shell will have a damage value. That damage value can vary up to plus or minus 25% based on your dice roll, and once you have done enough damage to the enemy tank and reduced their health bar to 0, they are destroyed. Simple as. In War Thunder, the process is significantly more complicated. Essentially what you have to do is you have to reduce the number of crew down to the point where the vehicle can no longer move and shoot at the same time. In most vehicles, this will mean knocking them down to a single crew member. However, in the specific case of the Stridsvagn 103, because the driver has gunner controls, this will actually mean knocking out all 3 of the crew members. However, you don't necessarily have to fire 1 shell per crew member you want to knock out. This is where we start getting into additional systems you can knock out and additional shell damage. If you successfully hit an ammo rack and detonate it, the entire crew will be wiped out. Additionally, if you successfully hit a fuel tank and detonate it, the entire crew will be wiped out. On top of that, if it is an open top vehicle and you hit it with a high explosive round, the overpressure from the high explosive round will wipe out the entire crew. In fact, high explosive rounds, if it can penetrate the vehicle's armor, will automatically wipe out the entire crew. However, mostly this does just mean open top vehicles unless a vehicle is particularly lightly armored or you have a particularly powerful high explosive round. This is where one of the more notable features of War Thunder comes in, the little damage window at the top right hand of the screen. This damage window will show you what things you knocked out, not just in the display itself, but it will also have them listed underneath. It will tell you what crew members you knocked out, and it will tell you what crew members are remaining in the vehicle. This is a very handy thing to look at if you're a newer player and you don't necessarily understand what exactly you're shooting at. Additionally, this is where the preview and x-ray feature can come in handy, because in the x-ray everything is labeled, not just things like ammunition and fuel, but it will tell you which specific crew member is sitting in which spot, and this will in turn tell you where you need to aim to knock out something like, say, the gunner or the driver. Because a vehicle in War Thunder has to be able to both move and shoot, if the gunner or driver are knocked out, somebody else in the crew will move to take their place. It does take a short period of time to do this, however, but it is very notable that because the gunner or driver has to be replaced, you can theoretically knock out a vehicle's entire crew just by shooting the gunner or the driver in the face repeatedly. However, this is usually not the most viable tactic unless you're in a pretty specific situation. This also brings up the point that the reason why people will commonly shoot at crew members instead of ammunition or fuel tanks is because ammunition and fuel tanks don't always explode. Sometimes they will just go black in case in that situation you simply can't use them. Additionally, ammunition, and this is something very important to note, and it's the reason why most War Thunder players don't take full ammunition loads, ammunition and its location is updated in real time in your vehicle. So if you have 5 rounds in your tank, there are only 5 rounds in your damage model that can potentially be detonated. So it's important to keep this in mind. There is a feature called first stage ammo racks in the game, and these first stage ammo racks represent a position where the loader can easily get to the shells, and your crew will generally move shells into this first stage ammo rack if they have the time to do so between shots. So unless you know where the enemy's first stage ammo rack is, which is usually the place where they keep shells, it's often not a good idea to aim for shells in other parts of the vehicle. Of note, however, the damage report in the top right of the screen will only show shells that are currently in the vehicle, so if you do see undetonated shells in that report, those are free reign to shoot at. This is also where one of the most significant aspects of shell properties that we didn't discuss earlier comes up, and this is how the shell actually does damage. Things like armor-piercing shells, sabots, etc. will generally do damage in a cone. So if you're going to shoot it, you have to shoot generally pretty close to where you want to actually damage. Conversely, high explosive shells or armor-piercing high explosive shells will actually do damage in a sphere. So if you get those in the crew compartment at all, they will often do critical damage. This is the reason why APCR that has fairly poor damage and only does it in a narrow cone is often not used even though it has high penetration, whereas armor-piercing high explosive that does damage in a very large sphere and will generally knock out the entire vehicle if you get it anywhere in the crew compartment is often used over shells that have much better penetration. But of course, destroying an enemy vehicle isn't the only negative effect you can have on them. You can knock out systems and crew members. In World of Tanks, knocking out all systems and crew members is essentially just a dice roll. Not only is it a dice roll, but it's a dice roll that you can improve with some of your crew skills, but the enemy can also degrade by having their own crew skills. For this reason, a lot of internal systems aren't generally shot at least not intentionally, by World of Tanks players. The only common critical hit that World of Tanks players will usually aim for are your tracks, because this completely immobilizes you and you cannot move in any capacity. Now there are two stages of damage for each of your systems. One of them is yellow and the other one is red. When a system is yellow, it's simply operating at a reduced capacity. When it's red, it is no longer operational. If a system is no longer operational and it's red, your crew will begin repairing it automatically, which usually takes about 5 to 10 seconds depending on factors like crew skills. Once it is repaired from red, however, it goes back to being yellow, so it's still damaged. The only way to get it back to being fully healthy is to use a repair kit. A small repair kit will instantly repair one of your systems, a large repair kit will instantly repair all of your systems. If you're wondering what the difference is between a small and large repair kit and why you would ever use a small repair kit, the difference is economic. A large repair kit costs 20,000 silver per use, so obviously it is prohibitively expensive, especially if you're a free-to-play player. Crew work very much in the same way, and if you want to get your crew back, you will have to use either a small med kit to heal one crew member or a large med kit to heal all crew members. Yet again, the difference is the same. It is 20,000 silver for a large repair kit, so it is prohibitively expensive. And consumables like small repair kit, large repair kit, and fire extinguishers all have a cooldown timer of 60 seconds before you can use them again. If your vehicle gets set on fire, it will start taking over damage, and eventually the fire will burn itself out, but you will take a fairly considerable amount of damage unless you put the fire out. A small fire extinguisher you have to activate manually. A large fire extinguisher is automatically activated after only the first few ticks. Obviously, the difference is purely economic between these two fire extinguishers. For something like an ammo explosion, your vehicle is just dead, you lose all of your hit points right away. While aiming for critical systems is something you almost never do in World of Tanks, it's basically the only thing you do in War Thunder. As you probably saw, that's the only way to really do damage to an enemy vehicle. Knocking out tracks, knocking out engines, knocking out gun barrels, these are all very common practices in that game. If a crew member or system is damaged but is not wholly knocked out, it will simply operate at a reduced capacity, and this is represented by them being yellow, orange, red, etc. If it is fully knocked out, a crew member will either have to be replaced or you'll just have to get on without them, and a system will have to be repaired. The only way to replace an incapacitated crew member is to go to a capture point and hit the crew replenishment button. You can only do this one per battle, so you only have basically one spare crew member. And even then, only if you have researched the crew replenishment modification. For systems, you need to start repairing the system in order to actually get it operational, the only exception being tracks, where your crew will start fixing it right away. Now, of note, if you don't have the parts modification researched, you won't be able to repair it to full capacity. In the example in the background, you can see my engine is heavily damaged, but I don't actually have parts, so I am doddering along at a mere 7 kilometers an hour, trying to get to a capture point. If you get to a capture point, you can repair even if you don't have parts. Additionally, nearby teammates that have the parts modification research can also help you, or if you are on a capture point or you have teammates nearby, they can also help speed up the process even if you do have parts researched. While an ammo explosion will simply destroy you like it does in World of Tanks, ammo can just be damaged to the point where it's no longer usable. In that case, you can replenish it on capture points. In terms of fire, the fire will start doing damage internally, but it doesn't actually directly destroy systems, and it takes a while for it to brew up. So you actually do have a minute before you have to hit the fire extinguisher button to put the fire out. You start out with one fire extinguisher by default, and you can research the option to carry another one, or teammates can help you with a fire extinguisher if you don't currently have any remaining. The reason why you will often see players wait to put out fires is because the fire will take a while to kill you, but your crew will have to stop reloading and operating the tank in order to put it out. So most players would rather simply eliminate the threat first and worry about the fire later, because putting out the fire simply to be shot in the face doesn't really help you all that much. That being said, if you don't eventually put out the fire, it will eventually take out your vehicle. It doesn't simply do a set amount of damage like it does in World of Tanks. One very notable difference between World of Tanks and War Thunder is that while in World of Tanks, knocking out a single track will completely immobilize the vehicle, in War Thunder, while it does stop you from moving forward, it doesn't stop you from moving at all. You can still rotate the vehicle around on the other track if you feel you're perhaps a little too exposed and want to rotate your hull out of the way of enemy fire. One fairly notable difference between War Thunder and World of Tanks is how they handle things like multiple weapons and autoloaders. In World of Tanks, it doesn't really have multiple weapons. There are a handful of tanks that use a double-barreled mechanic, however this is realistically just one weapon that basically has a magazine of 2 shells, and that you can charge up a super shot where you fire both barrels. That's really about it. In all other instances, it kind of just functions like a normal gun with a magazine. Autoloaders, on the other hand, have a magazine, and while the shots within that magazine are relatively rapid, the magazine itself usually takes a while to reload. Or at least that kind of used to be the case. World of Tanks has been experimenting with a lot of other ways to do autoloaders recently, so some of them do break this mold a little, but you can always tell if a vehicle has an autoloader by looking at the left-hand side of the aiming reticle, because this will show you the number of rounds remaining in the magazine. Additionally, you can force reload the entire magazine at any time, even if you haven't necessarily fired all the shells. When it comes to War Thunder, however, when a vehicle has multiple weapons, all of those weapons will be modeled and functional on the vehicle, or at least most of them will be. Most commonly, this just includes things like hull-mounted or coaxial machine guns, possibly roof-mounted heavy machine guns, which are only really useful against aircraft or lighter targets. However, some vehicles, such as the American M6, does have a coaxial 37mm and 2 hull-mounted 50 calibers, meaning even if it's fired its main gun, its 3-inch gun, it's still a legitimate threat to lightly armored vehicles. Additionally, you have vehicles like the Magog Hydra that just has 2 Hydra rocket pods strapped to either side of the barrel that you can fire in addition to the main gun, meaning it's still a legitimate threat to everything, even while on reload. For autoloaders, the game basically uses the first stage ammo mechanic. However, instead of a normal vehicle where running out of first stage ammo just means you reload slower, in an autoloader, if you run out of quote-unquote first stage ammo, that means your magazine is empty and your gun cannot fire at all until you have refilled that magazine. And it does take a while to refill the magazine. You will see your crew automatically starts doing it if you have any downtime in the battle. However, if you're constantly firing, you might have to go to a capture point to do this, or retreat from the battle for a while. Of note in War Thunder is that autoloaders, unlike in World of Tanks, are not actually natively faster at firing unless they are faster at firing in real life, and the only innate advantage they give you is that they will continue loading irrespective of your crew status. So while some vehicles do fire faster, you also have vehicles such as the Russian T-90 that has a 7.1 second reload, which is actually relatively slow compared to all of the NATO 120mm guns it fights. Now there is one final and kind of intangible aspect of the attack process that we haven't really gone through, and that is what happens when you actually destroy the enemy. In World of Tanks, this is pretty straightforward. When you destroy the enemy, they just become a burning hulk, and also they leave a small pop mark on the ground around them. Additionally, when you take damage, you will have damage decals applied to your vehicle. This is fine and functional, if unspectacular. In War Thunder, when vehicles take damage, you can often see it directly represented on the vehicle itself. This comes in the form of things like dented fenders, busted fuel tanks, etc., and this can make the vehicles look impressively battle-worn after an engagement. Additionally, when you destroy the enemy vehicle, sometimes they will just turn into a burning hulk, but sometimes you will get some pretty spectacular explosions, especially if you hit an ammo rack. These are also randomized and rare enough that they don't exactly wear out their welcome, and nothing quite gets the dopamine going like seeing the enemy's tank being turned into a giant crater while their turret and road wheels fly in different directions and are on fire. One of the big strengths of World of Tanks is obviously the fairly shallow learning curve. Enemy has health bar, make health bar go down is a fairly easy association for somebody to make, even if they know very little about tanks. War Thunder's rather absurd complexity, both in terms of shell types and damage models, and how you're actually supposed to both get a shell into the crew compartment and do meaningful damage to an enemy, is probably one of its biggest drawbacks because it puts a very steep learning curve on simply trying to get access to the most basic part of the game, that is, destroying enemy vehicles. While we've gone over movement and shooting, there are of course additional ways to damage enemy vehicles like ramming. In World of Tanks, you can ram enemy vehicles to do additional damage and potentially break the enemy's tracks. And while speed is definitely a factor, the most important factor in determining how much damage you deal or take during a ram is actually the difference in mass between you and your opponent. For example, if an ELC Even 90 were to fly at full speed into the side of a mouse, the mouse would barely take any damage and the ELC Even 90 would be destroyed. Conversely, if the mouse were simply to brush past the ELC Even 90, the ELC Even 90 would take fairly considerable damage and the mouse wouldn't take anything. There is of course also a physics engine, so pushing enemies off of cliffs or into water is always a fun and interesting way to land kills, although obviously that is somewhat setup dependent. War Thunder doesn't really have ramming damage, although it does have a form of crushing damage, but in order to inflict this you have to be significantly heavier than your opponent and you usually have to shove them against something like a wall, so while it is technically possible, it's pretty rare. Of course you can still shove enemies off of a cliff, however it doesn't really do anything, and you can shove them into water to try and drown them, however if they are amphibious you will be somewhat disappointed in the result. Now we've talked about how you move and how you shoot enemies, so let's go into how you find enemies to shoot. And for World of Tanks, they actually have a dedicated spotting system. The spotting system is actually relatively straightforward. If your spotting range is 400 meters and the enemy has a 25% camo, you will spot them at 300 meters. Of course, all of that is only the starting point for the World of Tanks spotting system. Moving will reduce your camouflage, firing your gun will significantly reduce your camouflage, so you can also hide in bushes to increase your camouflage. Additionally, hiding in a bush and firing your gun will cause that bush to temporarily go transparent, so it won't count for your camouflage unless you fire it from far enough behind the bush that it's not actually within the radius to make it transparent. And of course, if you get within 50 meters of the enemy, you will automatically spot them even if there is something like a building in the way. As you can probably tell, there's a lot of modifiers to this system that can make it a little difficult to get your head around. There's also what's called a render distance, which is 550 meters. If the enemy is outside of that render distance, you won't see the enemy even if they are spotted by you or a teammate. This does bring us to the subject of spotting assistance. Generally this will be done by light tanks, but any vehicle in the game can get credit for spotting assistance by spotting an enemy that is not spotted by the person that is firing their gun. So if your light tank is well in front of you and is spotting an enemy for you, they will also get credit when you hit the enemy with one of your shells. Now, enemies that aren't spotted or are outside of the render distance are still hittable by you. You're still firing physical projectiles that can hit them, however they are obviously invisible and thus quite difficult to hit, but certainly not impossible. You'll probably also notice me using the camera zoom out feature a lot. In World of Tanks, you can zoom the camera out pretty far to try and get a good idea of the lay of the land and exactly where everything is in relation to everything else, which is a pretty handy feature to have. Teams in World of Tanks, especially on large wide open maps, can absolutely make or break on the skill or lack thereof of their various scouts. In World of Tanks, all crews currently come with the Sixth Sense ability. What the Sixth Sense ability does is when you are spotted, you will get an audio cue and see a little light bulb. This means that the enemy can currently see you. However, there is a 3-second delay between when you are spotted and when this actually triggers, and if you're suitably exposed, 3 seconds can be more than enough for multiple enemies to team shot you and take you out. In War Thunder it works a little different. While you can scout enemies on the minimap, you don't do so in the same fashion you do in World of Tanks. Instead, only light tanks have the ability to highlight enemies by using the active scouting feature, either while in the gunner's view or in the commander's binocular view. When they do this, the enemy will stay highlighted for a while and their position will be updated in real time for the rest of your team. However, unlike in World of Tanks, the enemies aren't invisible just because they aren't scouted. You can still physically see them with your eyes. Enemies will also be highlighted on your minimap if they are shot at by a teammate, or alternatively if they get too close to one of the spawn zones. That being said, maintaining awareness of the situation around you usually requires using both audio and visual cues in War Thunder. The third-person camera, using it to peek around corners or over hills, is very important. Additionally, having good directional audio is very useful in the game and can be vital if you're in a close quarters environment. That being said, War Thunder does have some consistency issues, especially at longer ranges with vehicle pop-in, and at close range you can have some issues with audio if a vehicle approaches you faster than it renders the audio. So all in all, while you can help provide vision for your team in War Thunder, you will have to rely a lot on both your own eyes and your own ears to find enemies. That being said, you will frequently see me in War Thunder checking the scoreboard. both to see how many tickets both sides have and to see how many active vehicles are left in the match. In World of Tanks, you can actually enable a lot of toggles on the minimap to show you last known enemy positions, last known enemy health bar, etc, etc. So World of Tanks is a little better at presenting the information to the player at a glance. Of course, now that we have all of that out of the way, how do you actually win a game? In World of Tanks, there are actually 3 different variations of game you can play. One of them is where both teams have a capture point, one of them is where there is a single neutral capture point, and the last one is an attacker-defender scenario. Of note, in World of Tanks, there are no respawns, and destroying the entire enemy team will also cause you to win the game. However, if the game goes to time and you're not playing the attacker-defender scenario, the game will automatically end in a draw. But in the attacker-defender scenario, if the game does go to time, it will automatically go to the defender. Of note, in World of Tanks, capturing a zone results in the immediate end of the match, or not quite immediate. There's actually a delay of several seconds after you capture a zone, but before the game actually ends, and this also gives the enemy a chance to either A, destroy your last tank, or B, capture your zone themselves. This can lead to more draws than it really should, and I'm not sure why you would put a feature like this that enables more draws in the game. It just seems like a very odd choice to me. Notably, with zone caps, it does take a while to capture a zone, and taking damage will reset your portion of the cap. On top of that, if the enemy is also on the capture point, you will then stop capture progress, so it can be very difficult to do while the enemy is still alive. It's also notable that the attacker-defender scenarios uses a completely different setup from the other 2 scenarios. So instead of going essentially lengthwise, you now go widthwise, and a lot of the maps really weren't designed to be played in this fashion, so it does really change the map dynamics in a way that isn't always positive. On the whole, I found the vast majority of World of Tanks games were going to kills, not caps, simply because capturing the zone took too long and was too easily interrupted, whereas taking out the enemy was fairly easy, especially as the games did tend to snowball a bit as you started to get a pretty substantial advantage. War Thunder also has 3 common game modes, although they do function pretty differently than how they do in World of Tanks. You have a 1 cap, a 2 cap, and a 3 cap. The 1 cap and the 3 cap both essentially work on the same principle, wherein if you control more capture points than the enemy team, you will start bleeding away their tickets. Additionally, destroying enemy vehicles takes away 100 tickets as well, so a combination of capture points and destroying the enemies will result in the enemy slowly losing tickets until you ultimately win. And now is a good time to bring up the spawn system in War Thunder. When you drop into a match in War Thunder, you have 450 spawn points to spend on vehicles. Heavy tanks and tanks at the high end of the battle rating range you're playing cost more spawn points, whereas anti-airs, tank destroyers, and tanks at the lower end tend to cost less. As long as you have the spawn points, you can keep spawning in vehicles, although vehicles of the same type do start to get progressively more expensive the more time you spawn them. Spawning additional vehicles will consume spawn points, but doing useful actions such as destroying enemies, capturing points, getting assists, etc. will also give you spawn points. Because of this, while it is technically possible to run the enemy completely out of a spawn to the point where you just win, it is actually fairly uncommon. Now you'll notice I haven't mentioned the 2 capture point yet, and that's because it works very differently from the other 2. In the 2 capture point setup, both teams start with control of their own point, and the enemy has to take control of it. And once the enemy takes control of it, they essentially automatically win, which of course makes this game mode feel very reminiscent of playing World of Tanks. Interestingly enough, in the last update, they did add another caveat that you could use to win the game, that was by getting 60 enemy kills. However, even with this additional win condition, these maps still go to time far more often than the other 2. Whenever a map goes to time in War Thunder, whether it be 1, 2, or 3 cap, the winner is always the team with the most tickets left when the time runs out. The combination of these factors means it's fairly difficult to run the enemy team completely out of vehicles, so 9 times out of 10 games in War Thunder will go down to a combination of tickets from zone caps and kills, or in the case of the 2 cap map, will actually go down to whoever has the most tickets left remaining at the end of the timer. One could easily look at War Thunder's more sluggish and authentic features versus World of Tanks' more arcadey gameplay and think that World of Tanks is a very fast-paced game, whereas War Thunder is a much slower and more methodical game, in which case prepare to have your mind blown because it's actually kind of the other way around. I would broadly characterize World of Tanks as a methodical team-based game, somewhat in the veins of something like Overwatch or League of Legends. The objective is always to do what is best for your team in a given moment, whether it be holding a lane, scouting the enemy, or providing fire support to your teammates. And the big reason for this is the time to kill, or TTK. The TTK in World of Tanks, the time from which you land your first shot and do damage to the enemy to the time in which you destroy them in a one-on-one duel, is around 30 seconds to a minute, which makes it very impractical for you to try to take on enemies
enemies one-on-one, and much more practical to try and take out enemies or for them to take out you using team shots. Now, a long TTK in a game does two things. Number one, it means that generally speaking in a one-on-one fight, the better player will come out on top. A long TTK favors prolonged accuracy and landing multiple shots over a period of time versus just getting lucky once. The downside to a long TTK is fairly straightforward. It's actually very difficult to take on multiple enemies at the same time. If you get caught in part of the map on your own and the enemies were to realize this and two of them were to push you at the same time, if they have double the hit points and double the damage per minute, you're probably going to lose that fight no matter how good you are unless you have some kind of overwhelming advantage against them. This also combines with the spotting system, wherein many of the tanks that can do a lot of the frontline fighting aren't great at spotting enemies without getting seen themselves. And the tanks that are really good at spotting the enemy and not getting spotted are generally not that efficient in terms of dealing with the enemy. In this respect, the dynamic and individual elements of World of Tanks often boil down to trying to extend the vision of your team to enable your long-range shooters to land shots, or trying to use your heavy armor to push up to the next corner, or alternatively trying to set up your long-range gun in a better flanking position so you can shoot around the enemy's cover. It always happens in context of your team, it's never done in a vacuum. While the team-based element can feel amazing when it's working and everybody's firing on all cylinders, it can also be incredibly frustrating if you get stuck on a big long-range map and all of your light tanks are fighting to share that one single brain cell they got. War Thunder, on the other hand, is more of a dynamic and individual game along the lines of Call of Duty, and a lot of this feel comes from the very short TTK in War Thunder, wherein basically every tank in the game can be taken out with a single well-placed shot. This also means pulling off a successful flank will mean taking out enemies basically on reload, and you can roll up the entire flank on yourself if you're good enough and quick enough about it, as you can frequently take out multiple enemies before the second or third one even knows you're there. An obvious downside to a very fast TTK is that enemies can also kill you very fast if there's an enemy that you didn't see or that's hiding in a corner. However, to some extent this is mitigated by having a system with multiple respawns, so just because you missed one enemy doesn't mean you're out of the match, you're just out of that one vehicle. And obviously, even if two enemies do shoot you, all this really means is that you have to bounce one of their shots or absorb it, and then you can effectively take out both of them. Much like how World of Tanks does have dynamic and individual elements, there are of course methodical and team-based elements to War Thunder, but they do take a bit of a secondary role compared to simply being able to land your shots and make relatively quick decisions on your own. This ability to clear out one or more enemies in relatively quick succession does also contribute to War Thunder having a more dynamic map environment, whereas World of Tanks tends to take a while to progress from one part of the map to the next, just because of how many shots it will take to wipe out a given enemy. Now, I didn't make the comparison to Call of Duty idly. In the game Call of Duty, if you go on a long enough kill streak, you can earn a nuke, and dropping the nuke will immediately end the match. In War Thunder, you can go on a long enough kill streak and earn a nuclear bomber if you're at battle rating 6.7 or higher. This nuclear bomber will spawn at the airfield and you have to fly it all the way to the ground battlefield and drop the bomb. However, if you can do this, your team will automatically win no matter what the scoreboard looks like or whatever shape your team is in. And for me, the ability to simply play out of your mind and drag your team across the finish line, whether they want to or not, is actually one of the big defining factors that really differentiates the moment-to-moment feel of these two games. All vehicles in World of Tanks are broadly split across 5 different classes. You have light tanks, medium tanks, heavy tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery. Now, you might assume with how regimented World of Tanks is with a lot of its aspects that these classes would be very well defined, in which case you would actually be kind of incorrect. It turns out there aren't any universal class features for any of these classes outside of specifically the artillery class. There are of course general rules, such as heavy tanks usually having good armor and good hit points, medium tanks usually being somewhat more versatile, and of course light tanks having good concealment and spotting. However, these are only general rules. If the designers simply choose to alter a vehicle's stats to where it is more in line with a vehicle of another class, then they can just do it at any time, and they have done it several times in the past. To use some basic examples, if you were to go to tier 10 and look at the mouse and compare it side by side with the AMX-50B, the mouse is a very heavily armored ball of hit points that can take an absolute punishment, whereas the AMX-50B is almost more like a fat medium tank that relies more on its mobility and burst damage and can't really take much of a beating. If you were to then pan over to the tier 10 tank destroyers, and you would see something like the T110E4, which is basically just another heavy tank, and side by side it with something like the Gorilla 15, which is really just a long range sniper with no meaningful armor to speak of, you start to see that a lot of these classes are really more guidelines than hard and fast rules. While light tanks are at least a lot more consistent at the higher echelons in the game and even the mid tiers, if you go low enough you will start to run into light tanks like the AMX-40 or the Valentine, which are very heavily armored but also very slow and can't really do the scouting role. Then again, at the lower echelons, the classes are even more of a guideline than normal.
This also brings up a bit of an interesting point. If you go to the collectors section of some of the tech trees that have been in the game for a while, you'll notice there's a lot of very low rank vehicles there. And that's because very early on in the game's life cycle, once you got through the first tier 1 vehicle, it would immediately open up to a bunch of different branches. Whereas now you go through usually tier 1 to 3 without really seeing any variation, and even tier 4 is pretty light. This leads to the first few tiers of the game being fairly homogeneous in terms of the types of vehicles you'll run against and even the specific models of vehicles you'll run against, although you can still get the collector's vehicles if you're high enough in the appropriate tech tree, but this does make the low tier matches feel fairly light in terms of overall variety. Of course, this does bring us around to the artillery class, which is a class we haven't really talked about that much up to this point in the game because it is fairly unique. How artillery works is that in artillery vehicles, you can't aim normally. Instead, you can either shoot from the third-person view or you can go into a top-down view. While in this top-down view, render distance is effectively removed for artillery pieces and you can see enemies anywhere they are on the map. Also, this is one of the few instances in which the range of a vehicle's weapon will actually come up, although in practice most maps are relatively small and the range on most artillery is long enough that you won't see it come up that often. Of note, artillery does tend to have a lot less hit points than contemporary vehicles of their tier, and combined with fairly poor performance characteristics and the inability to aim and a long reload, and they tend to be very reliant on their teammates scouting for them, and they can't really do a lot on their own. Now, artillery has 3 shell types, but they're somewhat different from the shell types on a normal vehicle. The first shell type has the largest blast radius and does modest damage, but it also inflicts a stunning effect that will reduce the enemy's characteristics for an amount of time based on the power of the shell and how close they are to the impact. The second type is a high explosive round that does more damage in a smaller radius, and the third type is an armor-piercing round that has no blast radius but will do more damage still. Now, a long time ago, artillery shells used to do a ton of damage, but also had a fairly high amount of randomness both in their damage spread and their accuracy. While this meant it was unlikely for artillery to land a direct hit, if it did land a direct hit, it could basically destroy any vehicle in the game. The system wasn't that well liked by players because it felt very random. You basically had no control over it. Obviously, if you knew the artillery was targeting you, you could try to put solid objects between you and it, but if it was the very first shot the artillery fired and it landed directly and knocked you back to the hangar, there really wasn't any meaningful counterplay. The stun mechanic, along with a reduced damage range for the shells, was added to the game to theoretically try to make artillery more engaging and encourage artillery to hit clusters of enemies rather than harass one specific person. In practice, what this has really done is made artillery more of a source of harassment than a source of damage, which hasn't really satisfied both parties. On the receiving end, players aren't exactly any more happy getting stunned than they are taking a bunch of damage, and the artillery players themselves, having an only marginal impact on the battlefield, aren't exactly stoked about it either. Additionally, heavy tanks barely taking any damage means they can basically stay in the same spot over and over again. They don't rely a lot on the crew skills and the things will be negatively affected by the stun to be effective, as they are reliant more on their hard stats like armor, and this means that artillery harassing the heavy tank line is almost a waste of time. It feels like Wargaming doesn't really know what to do with the artillery class, as they haven't added new artillery in a very long time, and even artillery premium vehicles are few and far between. And the selection of artillery basically hasn't changed at all since I left the game, which doesn't really bode well for that class. However, there are still some few standouts like the M53-55 for USA and the French Leffe premium artillery piece, but those are more of the exception rather than the rule. Now, World of Tanks does have a few subclasses, but these aren't commonly used for anything, except for one. The wheeled light vehicles for France actually have several special attributes that make them stand out, and not only that, actually make them kind of overpowered. For starters, they're actually incredibly fast compared to basically all contemporary light tanks, which doesn't exactly go well in concert with the fact that you do have to factor in accuracy RNG and even individual player ping. If you're on a fairly bad connection and you're trying to hit these things, it can feel like a complete lottery. Of course, for most light tanks, you can counter them by simply hitting the tracks. This will completely immobilize them and make them an easy target because it'll take them a while to accelerate back up to speed. However, hitting a wheel on a wheeled light tank only slows it down, and the wheel will actually begin repairing while the vehicle is still moving for some reason. So these vehicles can often take a hit to the wheel and not really be all that bothered by it, on top of the fact that you have to hit multiple wheels to actually fully immobilize the vehicle, and they can simply use a repair kit if they don't want to suffer the speed loss. The tier 8 and higher wheeled light tanks also have a rapid mode. This rapid mode allows them to switch between either being more agile or faster depending on what they need for a given situation. And of course, World of Tanks vehicles moving like they're on rails means it's fairly easy for even a relatively inexperienced driver to maintain speed, especially on some of the larger and more open maps. The developers also reasoned that it would be somewhat difficult to use auto-aim, so they actually gave them a much more generous auto-aim bubble than most other vehicles, and for some reason they also gave quite a few of them fairly high penetration, high explosive shells, so they're actually pretty good at taking out other light tanks. Now, the developer intent was that the view range of these vehicles being relatively low for a vehicle of their battle rating would limit what they could do realistically. However, what they failed to account for was that at this point, World of Tanks has so many different modifiers that you can add to increase view range and camouflage that they were able to do the job of a normal light tank perfectly fine if you were willing to invest the resources into it, but also had the other benefits of being a wheeled light tank at the same time. The developer's solution to this was fairly straightforward. While they did institute some nerfs, ultimately the real solution was to add a rule into the matchmaker wherein a wheeled light tank must be countered by a wheeled light tank on the enemy team. This officially makes wheeled light tanks the only subclass of vehicles in the entire game to have their own matchmaking rules. That makes a nice segue into World of Tanks matchmaking. Now, in World of Tanks, vehicles are separated across 10 tiers and the 5 vehicle types, and the matchmaker will generally try to make sure every vehicle of a specific tier and type is countered by another vehicle of the same tier and type on the enemy team. We've already seen one of the core flaws in this balancing philosophy because, well, obviously you can have a pretty big disparity between the stats of different vehicles even of the same type and tier. However, there are some other problems with the World of Tanks matchmaker. When you queue up for a match, you queue up with a specific vehicle, and then the game assigns you the map later, so if the map is not suitable for your vehicle at all, you just kind of get to have a really bad game and there's nothing you can do about it. Queuing up with artillery only to find yourself on Himmelsdorf is a pretty sad experience, but queuing up with a very slow heavy tank on a map like Prokhorovka or Malinovka isn't significantly better. The game also uses a system called +2-2 matchmaking, in which you can see vehicles 2 tiers above or 2 tiers below you in your match. So if you queued with a tier 7, the spread of tiers you could see in your match would be tier 5 to tier 7, tier 6 to tier 8, or tier 7 to tier 9. The stat disparity between a vehicle and another vehicle that is 2 tiers higher than it can be fairly pronounced. The amount of penetration you can expect even on standard shells is pretty different, as is the amount of armor, but it's also noteworthy that the amount of hit points and damage also increase as you go up as well. And this means a lot of scenarios where the enemy can just straight up take you out 50% faster than you can take them out, in which case you have to really play that situation incredibly well to come out on top, and you'll lose most of the time. World of Tanks does have various matchmaking schemes like 3-5-7, wherein you have 3 top tier, 5 mid tier, and 7 bottom tier tanks. However, these are only loose suggestions, and the game will generally try to make a match with whatever it can if it can't find that specific schema available. One of the theoretical benefits of the World of Tanks system is that because the game knows what vehicle you're in when you go into the matchmaking process, it could theoretically match you better. However, because it only looks at the tier and type of vehicle, and as we've discussed, you can have a lot of variance between different types, you can end up with some very asymmetric matches, especially if you have maps that heavily favor one type of tank over another. Vehicle classes in War Thunder are usually marked by what vehicles do or don't have. In the case of heavy tanks, they don't really have any extra features, they just have a higher spawn cost, with the assumption being that their ability to bounce shells and their powerful guns are probably going to do a lot of work in terms of getting them extra score and spawn points. Self-propelled guns, or tank destroyers as they're more commonly called, also don't have any special abilities but do have a much lower spawn cost than most other vehicles, meaning you can often take them out even if you're getting fairly low on spawn points, which makes them a good choice for any lineup. Medium tanks have a moderate spawn cost and have access to the artillery modification. What artillery does is, if you have researched it, you can call an artillery on part of the battlefield. There will be 3 spotter rounds using orange smoke to bracket the area, and then a barrage will take place on that area. While artillery is a pretty big threat to lightly armored vehicles, it has to land a pretty good hit against heavily armored vehicles to take them out, but it is certainly possible. And of course, sometimes artillery does dumb things like take out planes. It is still a projectile after all, and thus can theoretically hit anything. How frequently you can call in artillery and how accurate it is will depend on the crew skills of your vehicle. Now, for moment-to-moment gameplay, the rank of a vehicle in War Thunder usually doesn't mean anything, it's almost exclusively used for researching. However, specifically for light tanks in the light tank master race, it is used to determine what superpowers they unlock. At rank 2, light tanks unlock the ability to scout enemies, at rank 6 they unlock the ability to use a drone to scout enemies, and at rank 7 they unlock the ability to use thermal imaging on their drone to scout enemies. They also have access to artillery strikes and frequently have access to other abilities as well. On top of that, light tanks also have access to the airstrike modification, so when they scout enemies, this will actually reduce the spawn cost of any planes they want to spawn. And of course, this brings us to the anti-air class. Anti-airs generally have fast-firing autocannons, they have one of the
lowest spawn costs in the game, and they also have access to artillery strikes. They can try to affect the battlefield that way. Some of the higher tier missile-based anti-air that can't really hurt ground vehicles all that well do get access to scouting, so they can do something if there are no planes in the air. While there are of course always vehicles that break the mold, on the whole War Thunder vehicles do generally abide by these rules more often than they don't. This of course brings us to a widely debated part of War Thunder, and that is how aircraft work. While planes do have a spawn cost and you spawn them like you do any ground vehicle, their spawn cost is typically high enough that you can't spawn them at the beginning of a match. Additionally, unlike other ground vehicles where their spawn cost is generally fixed, the spawn cost of an aircraft will vary based on how much ordnance you take out and what types of ordnance you take out. So a clean wing fighter is going to cost noticeably less to spawn than a fully equipped ground attacker. Now obviously the anti-air class is meant to counter the air to an extent, however at most battle ratings these simply represent a soft counter rather than a hard counter. It doesn't completely remove the viability of aircraft, especially if the aircraft is particularly good at flying and you are not particularly good at shooting at it. Air and anti-air obviously have some of the biggest technology leaps as you go from low tiers to high tiers. At the low tiers you're shooting autocannons and heavy machine guns at planes that are simply firing normal rockets and bombs, whereas at high tiers you have various guided missiles, laser guided bombs, optically guided missiles and bombs being thrown at each other. In this respect, understanding the technical limitations of the munitions of both sides is actually just as important, if not more so, than accurately landing your shots, as a lot of the munitions will generally hit targets pretty easily. This is also where the more esoteric parts of War Thunder come in, because there's a big difference between an anti-aircraft shooting an infrared missile or a radar guided missile at you, and there's also a big difference between an aircraft dropping a laser guided bomb or firing an optically guided missile at your anti-aircraft, and you do kind of need to know this if you're going to be successful in shooting down planes or delivering ordnance to target. The reason why aircraft aren't universally liked is, well, a lot of ground vehicles simply don't have a meaningful way to counter them effectively, especially when you're talking ground vehicles that don't have any kind of roof-mounted machine gun. It can often feel like you're simply at the mercy of the pilot, and whether or not that pilot lands its shot has very little to do with your actions and everything to do with their skill. Additionally, you have what's referred to as revenge casts, where you take somebody out and they have enough spawn points to spawn an aircraft and they come out looking specifically for you, and in that case there's often not much you can do about it. In this respect, I would actually liken Air in War Thunder to old school artillery in World of Tanks, in that it often feels very random as to exactly when you get targeted, as the enemy might go after you because you're in a strategic position, you're doing something useful, or you're taking a point, or they might just target you because you're the first thing they saw and you really don't have any way to control this. However, much like artillery in World of Tanks, air often isn't that powerful, at least for its spawn points. Sure, a plane with two 1,000-pound bombs can seem like there's nothing you can do about it, but the spawn cost they paid for it and the amount of time it takes for them to rearm is actually fairly considerable, and they could easily have done just as much if not more damage in a ground vehicle. The major advantage of planes is that you can be anywhere on the battlefield fairly quickly delivering your ordnance, and this works incredibly well if you're in a squadron and one of your teammates requests help, and it always feels very satisfying to land that perfectly placed bomb to save your teammate from certain demise. That being said, while you can generally convince most War Thunder players to begrudgingly accept the existence of planes in the game, it's a lot less common to find players that will adamantly defend helicopters. Helicopters have a lower spawn cost, they have a lower repair cost, they can spawn with a lot more guided missiles, and they can also use terrain to their advantage and stay on station harassing you endlessly until they take you out. If a plane misses you with a bomb or a missile, they have to reset for an entire attack pass to attempt again, and they only have so many of them. If something like an Apache or a Ka-50 misses you with one of their missiles, they still have at least 10 more ready to go, and they can just stay there and fire the next one as soon as the first one misses. There's also the problem that helicopters can be spawned at the beginning of the match. When you do this, you can only take things like gun pods and rockets, and of course they are an easier target than a plane, but the helicopter rushes still represent a fairly annoying aspect of War Thunder, as your entire team now has to focus fire these helicopters down, since helicopter damage models are still at best very wonky and often don't take damage like they should. For better or worse, close air support is just an intrinsic part of War Thunder, and it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. This does, however, bring up an interesting point, because it turns out in War Thunder and World of Tanks there is no friendly fire, with one very notable exception. For all types of aircraft, both planes and helicopters, friendly fire is in fact enabled, and you can shoot down friendly planes, and friendly planes can destroy you with their own bombs. There is a mechanic in which you can forgive teammates for destroying you, and there is also a mechanic wherein if you kill too many teammates, you will automatically get kicked from the match. This is especially common on aircraft with absolutely massive bombs like the British Lancaster with its 12,000 pounds encounter in which you will sometimes see a teammate drop a bomb, take out half of your own team, and then also immediately get kicked from the match. Of note, if you are destroyed by a teammate, you won't have to pay the repair bill, so there is at least that aspect of it. It is important to keep in mind that not all vehicles are symmetrically applied across all battle ratings. Heavy tanks don't appear at very low battle ratings, and they also tend to disappear around battle rating 7.7, despite the top tier being all the way up at 11.7. The highest battle rating heavy tank in a main tech tree is the Soviet T-10M, and the highest battle rating heavy tank overall is the event vehicle, the Object 279 at 9.0, and above this there are no heavy tanks in the game. Tank destroyers also tend to thin out fairly considerably around the 9.7 to 10.0 BR, so at the absolute highest tier of the game, it is a lot of main battle tanks, aka medium tanks, fighting it out, with some light tanks and anti-air supporting. The matchmaker in War Thunder works very differently than it does in World of Tanks. When you queue up for a match in War Thunder, you automatically take all of the vehicles that you currently have queued for the selected nation into the match with you, and it will pair you based on the battle rating of the highest BR vehicle you currently have. So if you have a BR 5.7 vehicle and a BR 6.7 vehicle in the same lineup, you will get BR 6.7 matchmaking. War Thunder uses a plus or minus 1 BR system, that is to say 6.7 could get paired up as high as 7.7 or as low as 5.7. Each BR jump in War Thunder has effectively 2 sub BR jumps, so if you had a 5.0 to 6 point match, you could have 5.0, 5.3, 5.7 or 6.0 vehicles. Of note, unlike the plus-minus-2 matchmaking in World of Tanks, because vehicles can be knocked out with a single well-placed hit in War Thunder, it doesn't tend to be as punishing to get a max up tier in War Thunder as it is in World of Tanks. War Thunder also has a general matchmaking rule wherein no more than about a third of any given lobby can be at the highest possible battle rating, so a 5.7 vehicle will never fight an entire lobby of 6.7 vehicles. However, one major difference is that War Thunder pairs you based on the nation you're in, and unless it's really having some trouble with the matchmaker, will generally try to keep one nation to one team, so you'll have, for example, Germany and Russia fighting USA, France, Britain, etc. The problem with this national matchmaking is not every country has access to the same types of vehicles at the same battle rating, so you can end up in scenarios where the combination of countries you or the opposing team get has obvious gaps and there's not really much you can do about it. All that being said, the War Thunder matchmaker does have one noticeable advantage, and that is you get to see the map and battle rating spread that you're playing at before you decide which specific vehicles you want to spawn, so you can select vehicles that are appropriate to the map and battle rating range, and you don't necessarily have to play a vehicle that will just be completely useless on that map. This does encourage the player to have a decent variety of vehicles available so they can cover a wide variety of different situations and battle rating ranges for their lineup. Now, all of the mechanics we've discussed are all well and good, but in order to truly understand a game, you also have to understand the general map design philosophy and how this translates into the moment-to-moment gameplay. World of Tanks has a very cohesive map design philosophy, often consisting of multiple lanes between 2 and 3. Each lane will have its own attributes that make it better suited or worse suited for certain types of vehicles and certain types of stats. In other words, you'll usually have lanes that are dominated by light tanks and long-range guns, and also much closer range lanes that are dominated by heavy tanks with good hull down protection. That being said, there are several maps that don't really have a good place for one type of vehicle to play. Himmelsdorf is a prime example in that there are very few good places for light tanks or even medium tanks or tank destroyers that have very little armor in which they can have an impact on the battlefield, and of course artillery in a close range urban map like this is obviously not going to go very well. On the opposite end of that spectrum is obviously a map like Prokhorovka, where there are no real close range lines of sight you can go for other than maybe the hill, although that takes a very long time to get to, especially if you're in a large, heavily armored and slow moving vehicle. If you're grinding the same vehicle or the same types of vehicles a lot because you're going up a specific branch in a tech tree to get to a specific tier 10 vehicle, this map design philosophy can start to get very monotonous, as you'll often find yourself going to the exact same spot basically every time you play on the exact same map, because there simply isn't much of a compelling reason to go anywhere else. Not only is there not much of a reason to do so, but often straying outside of a lane in which your vehicle is well statted to deal with will lead to you simply getting annihilated by enemies you simply had no chance of ever defeating. The spotting system also leads to a lot of World of Tanks maps having effectively large dead zones or no man's lands in which you can't realistically cross it because you'll simply get spotted and team shot from so many different directions you basically stand no chance of crossing that distance, even if you aren't going to be taken out by a single shot. One aspect of World of Tanks map design that you'll definitely start to notice more and more as you go up in battle rating is how many rubble piles or sand piles or piles of rocks are added to specific lanes to allow hull down vehicles to hide their hull and only only show you part of their turret or even just their upper front plate. While these hold down positions can be very common at the main point at which the two teams are expected to fight, you can also find them at several locations beyond that main point as essentially fallback points, and this creates a complex scenario in which even defeating the enemy at the main point at which you're fighting them can often lead to you simply going to another enemy in another very similar position right behind them. You'll also commonly find that the game loves to bookend these major conflict points on the map with long lines of sights and of course things like trees or bushes to allow for concealment for tank destroyers, meaning that you can push through an entire enemy team and then find yourself unable to move further without the assistance of a light tank because you're just getting pelted by vehicles that you can't see. The combined effect of all these features means that World of Tanks maps feel very rigid in terms of how you are expected to approach them as a player and what you as an individual in a specific type of vehicle are able to do at any given moment, and can also lead to a pretty steep learning curve because once you realize you're in a position that isn't well suited to your vehicle, it's often very difficult or outright impossible to change that position on the fly, so that map is probably just going to be a mulligan. World of Tanks has also recently added something called random map events, and these are events wherein you'll see a danger area on the map and you will see a countdown timer, and once that countdown timer goes to 0, something spectacular will happen, usually something like a plane bombing run, a plane crashing, a blimp crashing, etc, etc, and this will change how the map plays, which is an interesting addition. Anything in the danger area at the time the timer goes to 0 will be destroyed, friendly or enemy vehicle, and the specific placement of the events does seem to be thought out to open up the map a bit more and allow for a bit more movement if perhaps it has reached a stalemate, so it is a nice addition to the game. Notably, World of Tanks does have several maps that are exclusively available for tier 10 vehicles, and you will only spawn in them with full teams of tier 10s on both sides. Your teams are going to be split into 3 separate groups, and the maps are noticeably larger than normal, so it is a nice change of pace if you have made it up to the top tiers of the game. As we've discussed a bit in previous sections, despite World of Tanks maps being on the whole relatively small, you do have large flat open areas that you can move around in and generally pretty agreeable terrain modifiers, so simply navigating the map is usually relatively easy and the game on the whole doesn't find itself feeling like a bit of a driving simulator, which is always nice to have. The game also does a pretty good job of telegraphing what buildings are destructible because generally if a building is destructible it doesn't show up on the minimap, so if you look on the minimap and you don't see a solid object there, that's a good indicator that you probably can destroy it. On top of that, obstacles that directly get in the way of shots are pretty few and far between, and it's generally located to specific parts of maps, so you usually don't have to worry about the difference between high explosive or solid shot shells in most instances, although there are obviously notable exceptions. One area where I do feel like World of Tanks does pretty significantly outclass War Thunder is the unifying visual aesthetic of its maps. It's not simply that the maps look good, but rather that they usually have a strong visual theme, and on top of that they also typically have a strong audio theme with fairly good background music that is diegetic to the map you're currently on, and it does give the maps a very nice overall feel, and I really wish War Thunder would kind of get more on that because it does make the maps feel unique and interesting, even if they do often play very similarly. War Thunder often uses real-world locations for its maps, and by real-world locations I don't simply mean it is inspired by, I mean often they actually use aerial photography of a given location, at least as the starting point for a map. While this does make the map feel more like real locations than they do in World of Tanks, where they often feel somewhat gamey, it turns out most real-world locations weren't actually designed to be used as a map in a video game, and you do start noticing a lot of cracks. More often than not, there aren't prescribed places in which you are supposed to fight the enemy, you just kind of fight them wherever they show up. War Thunder maps also tend to have a lot of very confined spaces, claustrophobic city streets, weird sniping angles, and of course spawn camping locations, because why not? Depending on the map, it can also be cluttered with things that specifically block certain types of shells, like heat or high explosive shells, making those shells very awkward to use, especially in urban environments where things like light posts, fences, etc. can easily block one of your shells, which is all compounded by the notable inconsistency of the hitboxes in War Thunder that are at best a bit of a mixed bag. As we already discussed, War Thunder is perfectly happy to make an entire map relatively soft ground and thus hard to navigate, either having the entire map be things like snow or sand, and there isn't really a lot of thought given to making sure that you have more than enough room to drive a vehicle around at full speed, so oftentimes, even though vehicles in War Thunder can be faster than their contemporaries in World of Tanks, they often don't get to use this speed really all that much. If I were to describe World of Tanks maps as very regimented, I would describe War Thunder maps as very chaotic. There's a lot of nooks and crannies you can hide in addition, there's a lot of routes you can take, some of which can get you behind the enemy team, and when you add things like air into the equation, this makes for a lot of maps that end up being at best a giant mess. But I would also say this giant mess is part of the reason why War Thunder can add such a wide array of vehicles. I kind of discussed at the beginning of this comparison that vehicles in World of Tanks had to interact with each other in a specific way, and a lot of that is related to the map design, whereas in War Thunder, because vehicles can often end up in the side of or behind enemies very easily just by wandering down the wrong alley, you can kind of add anything to War Thunder and make it work as long as it is physically capable of destroying the enemies it fights. Now, after the major review bombing campaign that happened a while ago, and we'll discuss a little bit later, the developers have gone back and revamped a bunch of older maps and made them significantly better to play on. That's not to say that they're still great by any means, and there is still a very strong chaotic feel, but maps like Eastern Europe, Poland, etc. have been heavily reworked to make them less of a giant shooting gallery, and even some of the urban maps have gotten significant reworks. On the whole, I would say the maps do play better now, although they could still use some improvement. And of course, a lot of the newer map designs, especially maps like Holland, play significantly better than a lot of the older maps that you'll run into. That being said, as of time of recording, the map Karelia hasn't been updated in a long time, and the collision on a lot of the rocks in the map is very inconsistent. Sometimes a rock sticking out of the ground will do literally nothing and you'll phase through it, and other times your tank will go flying into the air. You just kind of have to know which rocks are real and which rocks aren't on Karelia, and the same problem applies to destructible terrain like buildings. For example, some buildings can be taken out with tank shells, but other buildings, the only way you could realistically take them out would be to carpet bomb the area in a B-17, which, to be fair, does actually happen from time to time. Incidentally, I find it amusing that the random map events recently added to World of Tanks are things like a plane face planting into the ground and taking multiple friendlies and enemies along with a city block with them, and that's just a normal day in War Thunder. One interesting aspect of War Thunder maps is that they don't always take place at the same time of day and even in the same type of weather. This can lead to fairly poor visibility situations or even incredibly fun situations where your team is blinded by the sun and the enemy team isn't. So while it can add some visual variety, it can also be a non-insignificant point of frustration. One aspect of War Thunder that it's hard to truly appreciate until you start playing the game is how unbelievably big some of the maps are. While World of Tanks usually goes with 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer or smaller, with a handful of the smaller ones being a little bigger, War Thunder maps can reach as high as 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers, and that's only the ground battlefield aspect. Remember, there are planes and helicopters, so the actual map, including the area the aircraft can occupy, is around 20 to 30 kilometers squared in most cases. Obviously, the areas that ground vehicles predominantly use are the most heavily detailed and textured, but they are still very large maps. The longest range kill shot that I have landed on a vehicle in the game is 3.27 kilometers, or at least from a ground vehicle to another ground vehicle. The longest range kill shot I've landed with a tank gun on an aircraft was 4.2 kilometers, and the longest range kill I've gotten on a ground battle in general was about 11 kilometers, which does highlight that while the size of the maps is very impressive, you will be a lot less than impressed when you are in a main battle tank and a plane with a laser guided bomb successfully hits you from 8 kilometers in the air. While War Thunder isn't quite at the level of World of Tanks in terms of unifying map aesthetic, and of course doesn't have any diegetic audio, they have at least been trying with maps that have a more different feel, with maps like Sun City and Holland entering the fray, maps that have more vibrant colors or at least a lot more variety in terms of the types of terrain that you can run into, so they are at least putting forth some effort in. Now, just as a side note, there are a lot of gameplay mechanics for both games that I didn't really go into either because they only exist at specific battle ratings or on specific vehicles. In this instance, while it is interesting to note the differences, it's not really going to affect your overall impression of the game. To learn about things like hull aiming mode, siege mode, laser rangefinders, laser warning receivers, hard kill systems, soft kill systems, etc, 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 it is academically interesting to note, but it won't really change your impression of the game. That being said, I am going to briefly touch on War Thunder's arcade mode because that is where the game will spawn you by default, even though most players do eventually migrate to the realistic mode. The two most obvious things you'll notice about the arcade mode is that you get an aiming indicator telling you where your shell will land, along with a penetration indicator that is very similar to World of Tanks. On top of that, you have a spotting system where you can spot enemy vehicles, much like in World of Tanks, and it will outline them. However, unlike World of Tanks, the enemy vehicle does not go invisible simply because an enemy is unspotted. On top of that, the aiming reticle will go away if the enemy is far enough, and the aiming reticle will not show a penetration indicator if the enemy is far enough away. On top of that, the automotive performance of vehicles is somewhat exaggerated, and the penalties for damaged components is somewhat reduced. A fairly large difference between arcade mode and realistic mode is that in arcade mode, you can't take planes or helicopters with you. They are effectively kill streaks like Call of Duty, where you need a certain number of kills in order to be able to spawn one. They will come equipped with weapons that are appropriate for their vehicle type and battle rating. For example, attackers and bombers will have large amounts of ordnance, whereas fighters will only have their basic guns. Your vehicle isn't destroyed when you spawn in one of these, and your vehicle can be found on the ground and destroyed by the enemy while you are up in the air flying your aircraft. Aircraft themselves also receive rocket impact and bomb drop indicators telling you where your weapons will land, which you only get in realistic battles if your aircraft has a ballistic computer. Light vehicles tend to struggle more in ground arcade because obviously it's easier to see them and know they're there, and they don't have a lot of armor. On top of that, you're practically guaranteed to see planes because of how they work, because your opponents don't have to research aircraft, and obviously with the bomb drop and rocket aiming indicators, their ordnance is easier to use. So now that we've covered all the elements to go into an individual match, it's time to start looking at how you research and get the vehicles that you take into that match. In World of Tanks, you start a tech tree by getting the tier 1 vehicle, although when I did start up, I got tier 3 vehicles for USA, Germany, and Soviet Union, so I think that's a new policy to help people get into the higher tiers faster, especially if they already had an account. As you go through battles, you will earn experience with that vehicle, and you can use experience to unlock upgrades, and as you unlock upgrades, one of the upgrades you unlock is of course the next vehicle in the line. Once you've unlocked all the upgrades for a given vehicle, it will get elite status and it will have increased crew training so you can train your crews on that vehicle faster. Notably, the upgrade modules can cover everything from new tracks, a new radio, all the way up to different turrets and different guns for your tank. In fact, it is fairly common for tanks to have significantly better guns that they can research, even if some of the other elements don't actually change. Now, simply researching an upgrade isn't enough, you actually have to spend the silver to buy it, and when you go to equip it, the game does offer the option to sell the previous piece of equipment, so you do get at least some of the silver back from that transaction. Of course, there are two big things the game doesn't really tell you. The first one is that sometimes researching an element on a specific vehicle will also unlock that exact same element for another vehicle later in the tech tree or even in different parts of the tech tree. This isn't super common, but it does sometimes happen and does give you a nice little bump when it occurs. The second thing the game doesn't tell you is that your vehicle actually has a weight limit, and this is actually somewhat annoying because it turns out your weight limit is altered by taking the tracks upgrade, but you don't necessarily need to research the tracks upgrade to get other things that can increase your weight. So it's a sort of soft prerequisite that you will only find out about after you've already researched something that is too heavy to equip to your current vehicle. This is slightly compounded by the fact that the equipment that you put on the vehicle will also take up weight, and this can make for a somewhat confusing and unintuitive interface, and I'm not really sure why the game still has this system, as it's inconsistent because some vehicles don't require new tracks at all and others absolutely do. And it's also a very new player unfriendly system because it's not exactly intuitive. In order to get to the next vehicle in the line in World of Tanks, you will have to put experience towards specific upgrades that are noted as prerequisites, and then once you do that, you can start putting experience towards that new vehicle. Once you've applied enough experience to that vehicle, you have now unlocked it, except you still need to pay silver to get the vehicle, and you need a garage slot for the vehicle, which won't be that big of a deal initially, but the garage slots will start to run dry after a little while if you don't put any currency into unlocking more. The progression through a given tech tree in World of Tanks is pretty linear. You can simply select a line and then go all the way up that line to the tier 10 vehicle without really having to consider what other vehicles you might have to research. I should definitely mention that World of Tanks has both free experience points and a blueprint system, and in theory you could use them to get another vehicle or skip a vehicle in a line that you didn't really want to play or didn't enjoy. However, in practice, these are very limited resources to the point where it's unlikely you're going to be able to skip an entire vehicle unless that vehicle is pretty low tier, or unless you have been playing the game long enough to have just accumulated a lot of that resource. Now I'm going to take a brief moment to rant because I started a brand new account for the purposes of this series, both kind of because I lost my old account and also because I wanted to see what the new player experience was like as of right now. On my old account, I had the Batchat 25T, the AMX 13105, and the AMX 30B, and the old school Watt players will know that all three of those vehicles branched off of the Batchat 12T back in the day. This made the Batchat 12T the vehicle in the game that required the most experience points to obtain elite status with out of all vehicles in the entire game. On top of that, the Batchat 12T was a tier 8 French light tank, and there was a premium that was relatively inexpensively available in the French tech tree called the ELC Even 90 that was almost objectively better than the Batchat 12T in basically every way. So because the matchmaker puts tier 8 lights versus tier 8 lights, I had to play against the ELC Even 90 a lot in the Batchat 12T, and I got a lot of chances to see exactly how outclassed I was in terms of both spotting and camouflage. Apparently I had blocked a lot of that out of my mind because I didn't really think about it when I had set the goal of grinding to the Batchat 25T for the purposes of this video, except as soon as I got to the Batchat 12T and looked at the research tree, I immediately had flashbacks and started seriously wondering if I had to get a tier 10 to make this video. Obviously I ended up doing it anyway, but I have played more games in the Batchat 12T than any other vehicle in World of Tanks by a very wide margin, and not because I wanted to. In War Thunder, each nation has a set of vehicles called reserve vehicles. Reserve vehicles are free and have no repair costs, and are going to be your jumping off point for that tech tree. In order to research upgrades for a vehicle, all you have to do is select that upgrade in the vehicle modification screen and then start playing games, and any research points you get will be automatically added to it. Notably, the upgrades have 4 different ranks, and you need to complete a minimum number of upgrades from a certain rank to proceed to the next rank. This is indicated on the left hand side of the screen. Of course, once you do complete all of the upgrades for a given rank, it will actually give you a research point bonus to whatever you are currently researching. While War Thunder doesn't generally require you to unlock a gun for your vehicle, it does require you to unlock shells, although whether or not the shells you unlock is better than the shell you start with actually kind of depends a lot from vehicle to vehicle. In order to research a vehicle, it's a very similar story. Just select whatever you want to research and all of the RP you get will automatically be applied to that vehicle. Of note, and this is a very big difference between the two games, RP is applied simultaneously both to a vehicle's modifications and to the next vehicle that you're currently researching. So if I were to earn 2000 RP with a vehicle, I would have 2000 RP both for its modifications and for whatever I am currently researching. Much like World of Tanks, once you unlock an upgrade, you will have to pay some silver to equip it, and of course once you get a vehicle, you will have to pay silver to buy that vehicle. We'll go into this more when we go into crews, but in War Thunder you don't have to pay for any kind of garage slot for a vehicle. Instead, you just pay for crew slots for a specific nation, and that dictates how many vehicles for that nation you can have active at any one time, and you can get up to 5 of these slots per nation without having to pay any gold. One sizable difference between War Thunder and World of Tanks is that any vehicle can research any other vehicle in a given tech tree. That's not to say they are necessarily good at it, and this is where the ranks come in. A vehicle can only efficiently research vehicles that are 1 rank above or below it. The further away 2 vehicles are in terms of rank, the less efficiency you will get. So while you could technically research a rank 7 vehicle with a rank 1 vehicle, it would be very inefficient, and vice versa. The ranks also serve another purpose other than just dictating what you can research effectively. You need a certain number of vehicles of a certain rank before you can proceed to the next rank. It will be listed on the left hand side of the tech tree exactly how many you need at each point in the process. This also means if you're trying to grind to a specific vehicle at top tier, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to plot out the lines you are researching so that you have enough vehicles at enough ranks to proceed on to the next one. In practice, what this means for researching is that if you want to grind your way to the top, you're probably going to have to get a lot of other vehicles along the way as opposed to simply the ones in the same line as that vehicle. A vehicle's rank affects almost no other aspects of the game other than the light tanks that we talked about earlier, so this does make them essentially just content gating, and they serve very little other purpose. Comparing the World of Tanks and War Thunder systems side by side, the only major advantage the World of Tanks systems offers is that if you want a specific high tier vehicle, you can simply grind your way up to it. However, the combination of having to use the same experience pool both to unlock upgrades for the current tank and unlock the next tank, and only being able to use one vehicle to research another vehicle, does make the game awkward at best at researching, and it's not helped at all by the unintuitive weight system. While War Thunder's rank system presents its own set of annoyances, the fact that you can research upgrades for your tank while also making progress towards the next tank, and if you don't like a vehicle you can simply skip it with no consequences, does make it a lot more player friendly. Now, it is important to look at the upgrade system in World of Tanks above and beyond the simple researching system, because this is something that War Thunder doesn't really have an equivalent system to. Simply unlocking a tank along with its best gun, tracks, etc. isn't really the end of the process in terms of making it the best that it theoretically can be. Each vehicle is going to have 3 equipment slots, and each of these equipment slots you can put pieces of equipment in to improve the performance of the vehicle. Now it's not till tier 4 that you get the full suite of 3 equipment slots. Tier 3 only has 2, and tier 2 only has 1, and tier 1 vehicles have no equipment slots whatsoever. Equipment slots can do everything from increase your vehicle's view range, to increasing your crew skills, to increasing your reload rate, increasing your accuracy, etc, etc, etc. Starting at tier 6, one of your slots is also specifically allocated to a certain type of equipment and will increase the efficiency of that type of equipment if equipped in that slot. While equipment on very low tier vehicles will run you about 40 to 50,000 silver, equipment on tier 10 vehicles will run you anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 silver a piece. This means that a single equipment loadout for a single tier 10 vehicle can cost you upwards of 1.5 million silver. Another upgrade system is the field modification system. Once your vehicle has been fully elited, you can now start researching field mods. Starting at tier 6, where field mods are initially unlocked, you will get 5 field modifications, all the way up to tier 10, where you will unlock a full 8 modifications. Some of the modifications allow you to take a penalty on one stat to increase another stat, and some of these penalties are harsh enough that you're better off just leaving that field mod uninstalled, but oftentimes there is a pretty obvious right choice. A tier 10 vehicle has 5 of these such mods, and they cost 150,000 silver apiece for a total of 750,000 silver if you want to install all of them. Another field mod allows you to apply an attribute that you don't already have to one of your equipment slots to allow that equipment slot to be more effective, while another field mod lets you equip a second set of equipments to that vehicle that you can flip between at the beginning of the match. There's also a field mod that lets you switch between a second set of ammunition and consumables at the beginning of the match as well. So in theory, you could have your budget consumables and ammunition loadout and your tryhard consumable and ammunitions loadout and switch them out depending on mode, map, or whether it's a full down tier or a full up tier. You also have directives that you can purchase for bonds that are essentially a one map bonus, either to a piece of equipment or to give your crew access to a crew skill they don't currently have. While in theory these upgrade systems could let you modify a vehicle to suit your personal preferences, in practice most vehicles only have one mostly correct upgrade path they can really pursue, with only the super versatile vehicles having a lot of good options. And of course, since the biggest stat you can't improve is armor, heavy tanks do heavily benefit from something like this because they can just improve areas where they're weak like view range and not really care that much. Now we've looked at a lot of different aspects of the vehicles in these two games, however both games have over 1,000 vehicles each, and it's important to understand how the developers go about trying to balance the overpowered or underpowered ones. In World of Tanks you'll generally get about 2 to 3 balance passes per year, and each balance pass will hit a handful, about 4 to 6 vehicles, with half of them getting buffs and the other half getting nerfs. These are only generalizations, however, as the developers don't seem to have a set time frame or cycle they work on, it's just whenever they decide to do it as far as I can tell. As far as the nature of the balancing, it's typically done by adjusting characteristics. These characteristics can include everything from reload rate and armor penetration, to engine power, terrain resistances, and everything in between. Vehicles also do sometimes get armor buffs, although this is less common than getting other soft stats. Since the developers seem to take their sweet time and only hit a handful of vehicles at a time, you would think they would do a relatively good job of balancing, except not really. While some of their balance changes, like with the Kronvang, do a pretty effective job of maintaining a vehicle as being viable while taking it down from being OP, you also get examples like the French AMX M454, which got buffed to the point where it became overpowered despite previously being basically useless. This in turn led to the AMX M454 also having to get a bit of a nerf, which meant the developers spent one of the relatively small number of slots they were using to buff or nerf simply to correct a previous mistake. Of course, not every overpowered vehicle gets nerfed. Wargaming really doesn't like to nerf both premium vehicles and event vehicles, and while I can kind of understand the logic that people have either paid real money or they have worked really hard to earn the vehicle and thus would probably be pretty upset if you nerfed it, it also makes for some pretty frustrating balance situations when you have to deal with the same vehicle in the same state again and again and again for months or even years. The best way to clearly illustrate the problem of premium versus non-premium balancing is when you look at examples wherein the developers decide to change a specific mechanic or a specific class of vehicles because they simply don't feel that the old design worked very well. As a practical example, the Italian Autoloaders originally had the ability to use a gun rammer because they didn't reload the entire magazine at once. They instead reloaded one shell into the magazine at a time. The designers subsequently changed their mind on this mechanic and removed the ability to equip a gun rammer to these vehicles to speed up the reload of the individual shells. However, when they did so, They technically removed it from the premium Progetto 46, but then increased its base reload so that it was essentially the same as though it had equipped a gun rammer. So it basically got the benefit of the gun rammer equipment without having to equip the gun rammer equipment, whereas all of the tech tree vehicles just got a worse reload and got no compensation for it. This kind of change obviously doesn't send the best message to the community because it essentially says we have determined that this mechanic is probably a little too powerful. However, you can just pay us money for us to overlook that. As a bit of a side note, quite a few vehicles that used to be in mainline tech trees in World of Tanks have now moved into the collectors section. These vehicles are technically available for purchase, but as far as I can tell, they don't receive any balance support whatsoever, so they just steadily get more and more power crept out of the game, and by and large, these vehicles were not very competitive to start with. While War Thunder lacks a strict schedule in terms of balance updates, it does have a pretty regular pattern in that between major title updates, you will usually have a balance update exactly halfway in the middle. Typically, War Thunder has about 5 major title updates per year, so this means about 5 balance passes per year, and basically every vehicle in the game is subject to being put on these balance updates. Sometimes they're fairly modest and only have a handful of vehicles, other times they're actually fairly massive and have upwards of 20, 30 or more vehicles on them. Unlike World of Tanks, War Thunder doesn't usually like to balance vehicles by changing their stats, instead preferring to change their battle rating as a means to balance them, so if they are overperforming, they get moved up in battle rating to fight tougher enemies. If they are underperforming, they get moved down in battle rating to fight weaker enemies. The closest thing to a stat balance adjustment a vehicle will get is if the vehicle is manually loaded, it may get a modest reload buff, because there is a bit of wiggle room in terms of how fast a human being can manually load a gun. Additionally, they may also change the types of shells it has access to, which again doesn't really change its hard stats but could change its performance. It's important to note when talking about War Thunder and its battle ratings that there isn't an actual cap to battle ratings. There is simply a soft cap that the company sets for themselves at any given time, and if the developers decide that soft cap is getting too cluttered, they can simply elevate the maximum battle rating up to try and give some more breathing room to the vehicles below it. This system isn't necessarily without its own set of flaws, however, as the statistics used to determine whether a vehicle is over or underperforming is based on average player performance, and there are basically 2 main issues with this. The first one is essentially the France tax. The French nation is not exactly the first one people go to when they think to themselves, I want to play really cool tanks, so it generally tends to be a player's second or third faction, and because of this you tend to have more experienced players on average playing France and other nations, but this also leads to French vehicles often being artificially nerfed in terms of battle rating, as the players themselves are a bigger deciding factor in terms of how well the vehicles do. On the opposite end of the spectrum from vehicles that tend to be played a lot more often by more experienced players, you have things like squadron vehicles and of course premium vehicles, wherein you can just throw money at the screen to have that vehicle no matter how inexperienced or low level you are. This can in turn lead to some of the popular premium and squadron vehicles having artificially lower battle ratings than they probably should. All that being said, the frequency with which War Thunder conducts battle rating changes and the large number of vehicles that generally get hit with each one means that 9 times out of 10, any vehicle you'll find in a given tech tree will be at least playable, if not half decent. We've talked a lot about the tanks, now it's time to start talking about the crews. In World of Tanks, there are 5 different crew positions. You have the commander, the driver, the gunner, the radio operator, and the loader. Each of these 5 crew positions has a certain number of skills associated with them that you can train on an associated crew member. There are also some general skills like camouflage, firefighting, repairs, etc. that can be trained on any crew member. However, it is important to note with these crew skills that you have to train them on all crew members in order to get the full effect of the skill, otherwise you will only get a partial effect. This actually applies to all of the other crew stations as well if you have multiple crew members that have the same crew slot designation. For example, if you had multiple loaders, which is the case on some heavy tanks, all of the loaders will have to be trained in a loader crew skill to get the full effect of that crew skill. This obviously begs the question, what if you have less than 5 crew members? So if your crew drops down below 5, you will often have crew members performing multiple duties. For example, you may have a commander that is also a radio operator. In this instance, if you want to take advantage of the radio operator skills, you will have to train them on your commander in addition to any of the commander skills you want to train. These are often referred to as high pressure crew slots because they require a lot more experience to get up to a base basic level of proficiency with a given vehicle. To use a practical example, the Batchat 25T has a commander that is also a radio operator and a loader, a gunner that is also a loader, and a driver. This is only 3 crew stations, but it has 2 high-pressure crew members, and this also means that if you want any loader crew skills, you have to train it on both the gunner and the commander, which is honestly just a lot of stress and part of the reason why you're probably not going to see a lot of loader crew skills on a vehicle like the Batchat 25T. Of course, the different roles within a vehicle are absolutely vital to keep in mind when you want to move crews from one vehicle to another vehicle. For example, in the Italian medium tank line, in the first few vehicles of that line, they have 4 crew members, a commander that is also a gunner, a radio operator, a loader, and a driver. However, as soon as you transition into the later Italian vehicles, the commander is now the radio operator, and then you have a loader, a gunner, and a driver. So you actually need completely different crews for the early and late Italian medium tanks. Of course, you can't just move a crew from one vehicle to another vehicle at will. There are 3 separate options for moving a crew from one vehicle to another vehicle. The first one is to do it for free, in which case you will take a rather substantial penalty. The second one is to pay silver, in which you will take a modest penalty. And the third one is to pay gold, in which you will take no penalty whatsoever. The only types of vehicles that you can move crews freely to and from without taking any penalty are premium vehicles. Now, this is a good time to remind the audience that these games are always in flux and always having changes made, because the exact nature of the penalty you suffer when you're moving crew members is going to change as of the next patch for World of Tanks. Currently, and for a while now, the penalty you would take is the major crew qualifications, i.e. the base characteristics of a vehicle the crew were manning would be reduced. So these are things like reload rate, accuracy, your mobility, etc, etc, etc. In the next update, what they're going to do is they're going to have it reduce the efficiency of your crew skills. This isn't technically as bad as simply having penalties in all areas. However, they're also increasing the amount of experience you need to get the crew fully trained on a vehicle, so you're going to have to spend some more quality time with a crew in a given vehicle until you get them up to the point where they can start earning progress towards their next crew skill again. The biggest observation I had about the World of Tanks crew system, other than its relatively convoluted nature, was that the World of Tanks crew system doesn't really allow you to go straight up the tech tree with the same crew, not just because of crew incompatibility, but also because if you're constantly resetting your progress towards the next skill, you're going to basically get to the top of the tree with very few, if any, skills, and having a high skill crew is relatively important to top tier. You are essentially going to have to take time out and dedicate time towards making sure you have a competent crew. It simply isn't going to happen naturally if you just try to progress forward as fast as possible. This of course can be slightly frustrating because the crew skills are absolutely vital to having an effective vehicle, as they provide bonuses to basically any area you could possibly imagine. In fact, crews are so important in the game that 2 of the most powerful items, improved ventilation and premium consumables, directly buff crew skills. So it is important to keep in mind that despite the crew system being somewhat odd and confusing, you will have to interact with it if you're going to have your vehicle operating at an optimum state. Now, for what is probably the first time in this video, the War Thunder system is actually a lot simpler than the World of Tanks system. You have the same base crew positions. You have the commander, loader, driver, gunner, and radio operator. However, unlike World of Tanks, you don't actually have to worry about what specific crew stations a vehicle has in order to simply train a crew on them, as you will get the bonuses for that crew member being there as long as you have it trained at all. The War Thunder crew system also focuses more on incremental improvements to stats rather than big flashy abilities, and the more you increment a stat up, the more the next increment will cost, so it's actually better to evenly spread your distribution of crew skills rather than try to hammer out something like weapon reloading or whatever. It's also notable that the repairs and agility abilities are actually averaged out among all your crew members, so you want to also keep those pretty even as well. Once you get your crew up to a certain level, you can actually expert your crew, which gives them bonuses to basically all areas for a specific vehicle. And if you already have a vehicle experted, you can earn XP towards acing it, or you can spend gold to ace it, although it does take a very considerable amount of XP or gold, so you don't commonly see a lot of players running aced crews. Now, a very important note that we kind of hinted at earlier in this comparison is that War Thunder doesn't use garage slots like World of Tanks. Instead, War Thunder uses crew slots. You start out with 3 with a given nation, you can get 2 more crew slots with modest amounts of silver, and from then on out you will have to purchase crew slots with increasing amount of gold.
You can put any vehicle you currently own for a nation in any crew slot for that nation. However, it's important to note that experience is not shared across naval, air, and ground vehicles, so you might want to try to specialize certain slots in certain types of vehicles. It's also very noteworthy that while there is an initial crew training cost of silver that is unavoidable, once you have fully trained a crew on a vehicle, you can send it back and forth between any vehicle they are currently trained on basically at will. While there will be a noticeable difference in performance of using the same vehicle on a low, mid, or high level crew, it's not such a large and pronounced difference that it can't be overcome with things like player skill, good positioning, map awareness, etc, etc, etc. Now up to this point in the comparison, we have thrown around some costs, but it's important to understand how things realistically cost both compared to each other, and of course how much you can realistically make to spend on all of this stuff. We're going to start out with a bit of a baseline comparison to let you know about how much things cost in game, and we're going to use as a comparison point the French Batchat 25T from World of Tanks and the Leclerc Azure from War Thunder, because those are two top French medium tanks, so they should be close enough for government work. The Batchat 25T will run you a whopping 200,000 experience points. It'll take you an additional 45,000 experience points to unlock the Top Gun, and 224,000 experience points to unlock all the field mods, for a grand total of 469,000 experience. Meanwhile, the Leclerc Azure will run you 410,000 RP, and it will additionally cost you 287,700 RP to unlock all of the upgrades, for a grand total of 697,700 research points for the Leclerc Azure. As you can see, this puts the average required researching for War Thunder noticeably higher than World of Tanks. Now from the experience cost, we're going to the silver cost. For the Batchat 25T, it takes a total of 6.1 million to buy that vehicle. It takes an additional 325,000 to buy the Top Gun, along with 750,000 to install all the field mods, and the current equipment loadout I have on it costs 1.4 million. This is a total of 8,575,000 credits. The Leclerc Azure, meanwhile, costs 1.1 million credits to buy, 483,000 credits to buy all of the modifications, and 310,000 credits to equip a crew to, for a total of 1,893,000 silver. Now, as you can clearly see, while the Leclerc Azure required a lot more research points than the Batchat 25T, the Batchat 25T is going to take considerably more silver to get it all the way up in research and into a fully upgraded state. Next up, let's compare the cost to take both of these tanks out on a mission. The Batchat 12T, if you were to take 4 magazines of standard ammo, 1 magazine of high explosive ammo, and 1 magazine of premium ammo, you would end up with a total of 51,400 credits to take that ammunition loadout out. And if your Batchat 25T is destroyed, you will be paying a grand total of 24,123 silver to repair it. For the Leclerc Azure, on the other hand, if you were to take 20 rounds of its top shell, which is pretty standard for a War Thunder match, you would pay 4,800 silver for that, and if the vehicle were completely destroyed and you had to repair it, you would end up paying a total of 6,795 silver to fix it back up. Yet again, we see the pretty obvious pattern that War Thunder is noticeably cheaper on the silver side of things, especially as I didn't really consider premium consumables because it's kind of hard to do the math on exactly how that will impact in terms of cost, especially because some of them you could theoretically use multiple times per map or not at all. Now, obviously War Thunder is my main game, so I'm going to have generally better performances in that game than I am World of Tanks, so I'm trying to evaluate some of my better World of Tanks games versus some of my average War Thunder games, if that makes any sense. World of Tanks has some daily boosters you can use to try and buff your earnings for XP for the first wins you get for a given vehicle or your wins in general. These win bonuses were in general, in my experience, a nice way to keep a steady pace through about the first hour or so of play, in which you have a pretty nice experience return. However, after that first hour it dropped off pretty sharply, and you'll notice a lot of these are victory rewards, and I found that anecdotally on defeats that the rewards were pretty awful even if you had premium time or other boosters up. On a loss, even one where I felt like I did pretty well, I would struggle to make over 1,000 experience in a single map, which is pretty disconcerting even though World of Tanks on the whole does require less experience to progress. That being said, I still found the experience side, especially through about the first hour of gameplay, went reasonably well. The silver side, on the other hand, not so much. In addition to the game having a lot of silver sinks that you have to consciously avoid in order to earn large amounts of silver, the game on the whole just doesn't produce the silver rewards you really need to make meaningful progress, and everything from buying upgrades to buying equipment all the way up to progressing to the next vehicle require fairly copious amounts of silver that gets pretty exorbitant once you get past about tier 6. Whenever I watch videos of epic carries in World of Tanks, I always make sure to watch till the end in the recap screen to see if the individual who carried their team in a dramatic fashion and wiped out most of the enemies on their own actually managed to turn a profit, and unfortunately, more often than not, they barely make any silver in these epic games. World of Tanks does have various boosters you can activate for more silver, more crew XP, and of course more experience. However, I did find on the whole that these boosters were very limited in terms of exactly how they applied, and I often didn't notice a massive difference between having them on and not having them on unless they were the particularly large boosters, which are available a lot less often than the smaller ones. This also brings up a fairly valid point about World of Tanks boosters in that World of Tanks boosters count down in real time, so when you turn them on you'll have an hour of real time to use the booster, and once that's up the booster is gone, regardless of whether that hour consisted of a handful of really long drawn out games or a lot of really good ones. In War Thunder, I found the research points earnings that I got for modest games was roughly equivalent to what I got for a fairly good game in World of Tanks. However, what I noticed pretty quickly was that obviously you do need more of it just to do anything, so it was on average taking me about as long. However, War Thunder was a lot easier to spike and get really big numbers, and this is because of the way War Thunder has the chevron system and the boosts. The chevron system kicks in when you get a minimum of 3 kills, and then for 3 kills, 6 kills, and 9 kills, you get a boost applied to all RP earned within that match. So it's basically like a mini booster that you just activate whenever you have a match that you're doing well. And additionally, War Thunder has some very generous boosters going up to 300 or 500%, and especially with premium time and of course the chevrons, you could easily hit 15 to 25,000 with a good enough game, which did allow you some pretty good spikes to make up for the fact that War Thunder does on the whole require more research points. The silver side of War Thunder I found absolutely blew World of Tanks out of the water, as I was rarely, if ever, even coming close to losing silver in a given match, even counting restock and repair bills for my vehicles. This is probably a good time to briefly discuss the review bombing campaign that War Thunder got hit by over a year ago, in which the customers were very unhappy about some unfavorable economy changes and decided to review bomb the game on Steam pretty religiously, and this in turn resulted in the developers ultimately conceding and making a roadmap with a bunch of quality of life improvements, including the aforementioned chevron system. They also foldered a bunch of vehicles so that you didn't have to research them if you didn't want to, and those foldered vehicles now took less RP in order to research, in addition to better economy and other various quality of life improvements. This comparison actually probably would have gone very differently had I been comparing these two games before that review bombing campaign took place, because the economy of the game was in a much worse state at that point, and it is worth pointing out because it is entirely possible War Thunder could slip back into that previous and very player unfriendly economy again. It's also very notable that War Thunder's boosters work very differently from World of Tanks boosters in that a War Thunder booster will last a set number of maps. It doesn't care about how much time it takes, or it does kind of care in that you have 24 hours in which to complete that many matches, but usually this is a pretty generous criteria. On top of that, while some of the boosters do come with a built-in expiration date, as long as you activate the booster before that expiration date, you can add another 24 hours in which to get all of your matches in to take advantage of that booster. Now, both World of Tanks and War Thunder are free-to-play games, so obviously they have monetization in the terms of both premium vehicles, premium times, etc, 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 and those all deserve at least some degree of comparison. Gold is used as a premium currency across both games, and it can be used to do a little bit of everything. In World of Tanks, gold by itself can buy some of the premium vehicles, it can also demount equipment, it can also remove the penalty for your crew skills, in addition to converting experience and also converting into silver, so that it can be used to both buy other things in game. In this respect, copious amounts of gold can generally just make your life a lot easier. You can also use gold to buy premium time, and premium time of course increases both your experience earn and your silver earn, and also gives you more map vetoes, although I've always found it to be a questionable feature to allow your players to play less of your maps unless you just don't have any confidence in your map design. Of course, in addition to premium time, you also have the new Watt Plus. Watt Plus gives you a small influx of both silver and gold. It also lets you demount your equipment for free, so it's easier to keep your vehicles in mounted equipment. And of course, it also gives you a small amount of crew XP to a selected crew every few minutes, even when you're not in the game. Watt Plus also gives you access to the
TS54
premium vehicle, and this vehicle is unique because it's the only vehicle that you can never own. It's basically always going to be a rental vehicle, and you only get access to it as long as you have Watt Plus active, and as soon as you deactivate Watt Plus, it is no longer available to you. Speaking of, while some premium vehicles can be purchased for gold, other premium vehicles are going to require cold hard currency, and premium vehicles generally enjoy better silver and experience earn rates, although as we've kind of discussed, you can't really research a tech tree vehicle with a premium vehicle unless you intend to get a lot of free XP, which is somewhat difficult, or convert a lot of your XP with gold, which is somewhat expensive. That being said, the increased earn rate can definitely be used to train your crew members that you can move to these premium vehicles for free. Of course, we also have to hit on the loot crates because World of Tanks has started releasing brand new shiny premium vehicles inside of loot crates. Now essentially how this system works is you have a set of loot crates and you are guaranteed to get a top tier premium for every 50 loot crates. However, there's usually a smattering of top tier vehicles, some of which are more desirable than others in these vehicles that you are guaranteed to get. So you're not necessarily guaranteed to get the vehicle you want, you're just guaranteed to get a vehicle in those 50 loot crates. If we were to look at last Christmas as an example, you could have gotten the XM66F, the Type 63, the GSOR 1010, or the Tiger Mouse, and the Tiger Mouse really seemed to be the one that most of the players really wanted to pull out of those boxes. In order to guarantee a Tiger Mouse, you would have needed at least 200 loot crates, and 50 loot crates seem to be about $80 US.
That would be around $320 US
to guarantee it. Now obviously you would have only had to spend that if it was the absolute last crate, but still that is a lot of money just to get a single brand new premium vehicle. And it's not the first time they've done it either. They also did it the previous year with the BZ176, which is currently one of the more overpowered tier 8 premium vehicles in the entire game. Of note, neither the Tiger Mouse nor the BZ176 have been available since they were offered in these loot crates, so if you didn't get them in the loot crates, you simply didn't get them. The other contents of the loot crates included some low tier premium vehicles, premium time, gold, basically all the same loot crate filler stuff that you would probably expect had you seen loot crates like this before. There were, however, some pretty fancy 3D styles in the box, including a hot rod for the EBR 105, one of the top tier 10 light tanks, and of course that 3D style, if you wanted to guarantee it, well, you just couldn't. There was no way to guarantee a 3D style, it was only the top tier premiums that were guaranteed, so you could have easily opened that 200 and not seen it. Of course, offering premium vehicles that are only available in loot crates does have a lot of fear of missing out, it also has a lot of artificial scarcity, and of course with Wargaming's reputation for not nerfing premium vehicles, if you do get a particularly busted one, you know it's not going anywhere anytime soon. All that being said, World of Tanks does have quite a few really powerful premium tanks, and the only thing that really keeps them in check is that, well, the game just doesn't sell them all that often. While the BZ176 is the obvious example, the EBR 75 hasn't gone on sale in the last year or so as far as I can tell, and the Panzer IV, a pretty busted tier 5 premium vehicle, also doesn't seem to show up at all basically. So the only major balancing factor to World of Tanks premium vehicles is that the game just basically doesn't sell them that often. On the whole, I would say the addition of Watt Plus and the increasing reliance on loot crates to release new premium vehicles, especially as they're coming more and more frequently, is a bit of a matter of concern for monetization for the game of World of Tanks. Much like World of Tanks, War Thunder also has gold as a premium currency, and you can also do a wide variety of things with it, everything from speeding up the research on individual vehicles, buying silver with it, upgrading your crews, and even buying select premium vehicles outright for gold. War Thunder also prominently features premium time, which has many of the same benefits in terms of increased silver earn, increased RP earn, and of course increased map votes. There is also one rather unusual benefit of premium time in War Thunder, and that is if you have auto repair and auto resupply selected in your garage, you basically can't ever lose silver on a match. The game will automatically refund you silver up to 0, unless of course you lost silver because of team killing, in which case you will still go negative. In addition to buying some premium vehicles for gold, a lot of vehicles are what's called pack vehicles. These are available for cold hard currency and generally come with both some gold and some premium time.
And whenever these go on sale, they are particularly good deals because you still get the same amount of premium time and gold no matter how cheap it is. Which kind of neatly segues into the topic of War Thunder sales. War Thunder commonly has sales for Golden Eagle vehicles. They commonly also have half-off sales for upgrades within tech trees. You can also frequently find premium time on sale, and they do also have pack vehicle sales, but those are fairly inconsistent, so it's not exactly something you can count on. Indeed, if you check with most War Thunder content creators, you'll see sale guides somewhere in their history, because it is a very common ritual every time a sale comes up for the various content creators to give you advice on what are and are not good buys. This also brings up an interesting point about War Thunder premium vehicles versus World of Tanks premium vehicles, in that War Thunder premium vehicles can research tech tree vehicles. In fact, one of the major benefits of a premium vehicle, in addition to the fact that it earns more and also comes with all of its upgrades installed, and additionally, unlike a tech tree vehicle, it can actually research all ranks below it efficiently. So if you buy a top tier premium vehicle, you can actually research anything in the tech tree with it without any problems, which is one of the primary uses of a lot of the War Thunder premium vehicles, is as grinders to get your way through a tech tree relatively quickly. This also kind of segues into the system of talismans, and you can pick up a talisman for Golden Eagles on any vehicle in the tech tree, and adding a talisman to a tech tree vehicle will give it the same research rewards as a premium vehicle, effectively allowing you to use a vehicle that you already know and like to research the tech tree more efficiently. Of course, any discussion of monetization in War Thunder would be remiss if we didn't discuss the Gaijin Marketplace. The Gaijin Marketplace is a place where you can go to both buy and sell items. Now, premium vehicles in War Thunder often come in the form of coupons, and these coupons can be bought and sold on the marketplace to turn a healthy profit or to try and track down something that you might have missed. The marketplace is also where a bunch of content creators go to sell skins of questionable historical accuracy. Given that a lot of the vehicles available on the Gaijin Marketplace are older event vehicles that may not necessarily have a large inventory of, some of the prices can get pretty ridiculous, such as E100 selling for over $1,000. That being said, the marketplace isn't even accessible through the main game, and you basically have to go through an entirely separate website in order to use it, so it's not like it's necessarily pushed on players, even if it is kind of a dodgy aspect of the game. War Thunder has started making use of loot crates recently, first for silver and later for gold. However, the loot crates in War Thunder tend to only contain older event vehicles. Now, while these are desirable vehicles that are no longer really available, they were at least available for free at some point, so going into these loot crates isn't the only way that any player has ever had to access them, so it's not technically as bad as World of Tanks. However, it is kind of veering into that territory. Now, I briefly mentioned skins that were of questionable historical authenticity, and you probably haven't seen too many of them in my games, and that's because by default War Thunder has non-historical skins disabled, so you actually have to enable these ahistorical skins in order to see them in your game, which is kind of interesting because most games actually want these outlandish cosmetics on display so that players will get curious about them and perhaps pick them up. As a final point of comparison, it is worth giving a passing acknowledgement to the various cosmetic systems in both games, as these can allow you to make your vehicle feel unique and interesting to you personally. In World of Tanks, you have everything from basic camos and basic 2D skins all the way up to elaborate 3D styles, and the 3D styles are obviously some of the most desirable as they tend to really break up the outline and make the vehicle look unique, and in general they do tend to spend a lot of work making these vehicles look really cool with lots of small details like glowing bits and moving parts. That being said, you can go into the options menu and select an option so that the outline of the vehicle is always the base body of the enemy vehicle and does not include these style elements, which is always a good idea because I have no idea why you would want the outline to include these extraneous elements in the first place. You can also apply various decals to your vehicle, and this is also a point where we should probably discuss the fact that these various camos, 3D styles, and 2D styles aren't purely cosmetic. They do actually have an in-game effect. They give you a static camouflage increase of 3%, so there is a direct in-game reason to equip these camos. Interestingly, you can take camos and 2D styles off of a vehicle and equip them to another eligible vehicle for free, so you could theoretically go up an entire branch of a tech tree only needing one camo and removing it from the old vehicle and adding it to the new one as you go. In War Thunder, you can unlock some fairly basic desert and winter camos simply by playing the game and getting a certain number of kills in a vehicle. However, there are usually several other camos that can only be unlocked for Golden Eagles.
Additionally, War Thunder does feature a lot of cosmetics in the form of various decorations that you can attach to a vehicle, not simply 2D but also 3D decorations, as you can probably tell from a lot of my footage in the background. These decorations can go all the way from relatively sane things like a teddy bear, a pistol, or a helmet, all the way up to fairly ridiculous things like a snowmobile or a working cuckoo clock. Interestingly, while the ahistorical skins are disabled by default, the myriad of fairly absurd decorations are in fact not, and you can see those perfectly fine. This is where we get to one of the more contentious aspects of the War Thunder cosmetics, and that are the bushes. Bushes are a form of camouflage you can apply on your vehicle, and they make the vehicle directly harder to see, so they do represent an in-game advantage. You can technically earn them in-game, although you do have to go through quite a few steps, and you'll probably have to look up a Wikipedia article on exactly how to do it. Otherwise, you will just have to spend golden eagles to unlock the various bushes, and of course the various bushes can both break up the silhouette or hide weak points on a vehicle, making vehicles particularly annoying to identify or spot. Bushes are a major source of contention among the War Thunder community and a lot of War Thunder players, but Gaijin did at least add the ability to shoot decorations off of vehicles or have those decorations be removed by explosions, so at least you don't have to deal with it for the entire match. To close this out, I'm going to give some of my overall thoughts on where I feel the games currently stand as of right now. I wasn't entirely sure going into this review and going back to World of Tanks if this entire process would either reignite my fire for the game or throw sand on the wick, but I was determined to try and keep an open mind and approach the game with at least some degree of a clear head on the matter. It must be said, World of Tanks has a very easy and pleasant new player experience. Everything from the concepts that are fairly easy to get your head around, shoot it green thing, enemy health bar go down, etc, all the way up to the fairly significant tutorialization, in addition to the fact that it also provides you with a number of maps where you can go around in different vehicle types and see relatively good positions for vehicles in that map. And on top of that, it also gives you a bunch of games with bots and then an increasing number of human players before you're thrown into the matchmaker proper. The combined effect of all of this is a game that it's very easy to get started in and very easy to get a basic proficiency with a lot of the core controls. In this respect, it's pretty easy for me to understand why World of Tanks was able to find and cultivate an audience relatively quickly after its initial launch within the first few years. I do have to say that a lot of the core gameplay loop of World of Tanks and a lot of what makes it engaging is largely still present, even if there are a lot of additional systems that do occasionally drag it down. All that being said, by the time you hit about tier 6, it does start to become pretty obvious how experienced the average World of Tanks player is, and that's not too terribly surprising. The game has been going on for about 12 years, but you can reasonably start to at that point run into enemies that have fully equipped tanks, fully equipped crews, etc, and it does start to become a lot more sweaty and try hard a lot earlier than it used to. This didn't exactly mesh well with the still somewhat archaic crew system that makes it fairly difficult to build up crew skills at any real speed, and also a silver system that will keep you constantly broke and scraping up every last bit of coin for that next upgrade or that next vehicle. As you get closer to tier 8, some other issues are going to start to crop up, such as the copious amount of premium vehicles that all have wacky or eccentric gimmicks, or the concerning number of vehicles that have few or no weak points on their turrets, so you're having to basically spam gold, and even then click for relatively small weaknesses anyway. At about tier 7 is where I transitioned from free to play to pay to play, using both premium account and Watt Plus, and also some gold, and the difference was pretty night and day and very noticeable, mostly in the areas of the crew and the equipment, because I could keep my crew basically trained on vehicles at all times, and because of the free equipment demounting that I got from Watt Plus, I could constantly keep my vehicles in good equipment, and this immediately resulted in a better performance. While this bot power essentially did kind of rub me the wrong way, it didn't quite hurt as bad as when a BZ-176 would kick in the rocket booster, take off half my health points with a ram, and then shoot me in the face for 800 damage. It's fair to say that World of Tanks is probably not in danger of being my main game anytime soon. However, I did go back and replay it even after I had all the footage I needed for this video, so that should at least tell you something. I didn't completely hate the game, and I still don't completely hate the game. I feel like it has merit, and there definitely is a class of players that will definitely enjoy it. However, at this point I just don't feel the game itself is for me, at least not as a main game, more of a side game that I play once in a while. War Thunder has a much harsher learning curve and a much more uninviting new player experience, not exactly withholding information, but not exactly telling you everything you need to know about things like ammunition, where you need to aim on an enemy vehicle, etc., and this makes for the game being a very frustrating experience, especially as last time I checked, you only get about 3 games with bots before it throws you into the matchmaker proper. Once you're in the matchmaker, you're expected to know things like where is the gunner, where is the driver, where is the ammunition, etc., on any vehicle that you're shooting at, in addition to trying to figure out where exactly you want to shoot them to even get the shell inside the armor to begin with. This and the lack of significant randomness on your shots means War Thunder has a very high skill gap that can be insurmountable to overcome for a newer player. All that being said, the game that War Thunder reminds me of the most in terms of its learning curve is actually a game like Dark Souls. There is a lot to learn in Dark Souls and it is very unforgiving, but there's also a lot of satisfaction to be had when you do ultimately learn and understand the systems that it has on offer. Because of this, the Dark Souls series took a while to really catch on in Western audiences, and War Thunder likewise had a very slow boil to getting to the point where it was actually a very popular and well-known game, because it had to build up that initial base of players that would wade through all the tedium and frustration first. That being said, it is undeniably very satisfying to just take a wild guess on some really long range and nail your shot, and it's equally satisfying to sneak up behind 2 or 3 people and take all of them out before they know you're there. All that being said, while War Thunder's moment-to-moment gameplay getting some minor tweaks is always appreciated, the biggest boon for War Thunder and one of the biggest reasons why I'm still playing it is actually all of the meaningful and positive quality of life changes that came from the review bombing campaign, where they improved almost every aspect of the game. Myself and probably many others were expecting the developers to simply do the bare minimum, give lip service to the players, and simply wait for it to blow over. However, they seem to have taken a fairly strong good faith effort to actually make meaningful improvements to try and re-establish some level of goodwill between them and the player base. I also can't deny that the generally more dynamic gameplay of War Thunder is definitely more appealing to me. It may sound kind of cliche to simply click super ultra mega better than the other player, but sometimes you just want to turn your brain off and do exactly that, and I would be kind of lying if I didn't at least admit that I do enjoy taking out planes and bombing people from time to time. It is just very satisfying to land that perfect drop. This is of course all punctuated for me by the emphasis on more authentic vehicles in War Thunder, which I always appreciate seeing over a bunch of experimental prototypes. However, that isn't exactly what carries my experience with the game. War Thunder is not without its flaws, both on a technical level and on a design level, and I will never pretend that the game couldn't definitely use some improvement in certain areas, and of course the pushing of increasingly more expensive premiums and their emphasis on loot boxes over the last few months have gotten me somewhat concerned and are definitely things that I will keep an eye on for the time being, although I don't consider them to be that bad for the game's overall health as of right now. On balance, there are simply more aspects of War Thunder that I like, both from a micro moment-to-moment gameplay standpoint and from a macro standpoint of the researching and design aspects. And that wraps up our big World of Tanks versus War Thunder comparison. Hope you guys loved it. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. You guys have been awesome for supporting me throughout this series, and as always, don't forget the shoes.